Have you ever imagined waking up as a villain character in a novel? That's exactly what happened to Elsa, an ordinary girl who suddenly became Victoria, the infamous spoiled young lady of the Baron Prosier family. But instead of continuing her lavish lifestyle, she decided to change her fate by rescuing a 5-year-old boy named Leon from a dumpster. Little did she know this boy was actually the lost nephew of Duke Chester Halos, the most powerful and cold-hearted man in the Chester Empire. In exchange for a massive reward to save her family from debt, Victoria unexpectedly entered into a contract marriage with the Duke. But behind the facade of this arranged marriage lurked dangerous conspiracies, dark secrets from the past, and a love gradually blossoming that neither of them anticipated. Will Victoria be able to protect Leon from those targeting the boy's life? And will Duke Chester's frozen heart melt before her sincerity? Join me as we explore this touching story. The ceremonial hall of the church is luxuriously decorated next to the altar. There's Duke Chester Halos and Victoria Leon, who is next to the bride, impatiently waiting for her consent as the couple exchanges their vows. They exchange rings, and the priest declares them husband and wife. The wedding left Victoria quite exhausted. This recap manhwa tells the story of a girl who, despite only inviting her closest ones, married out of convenience to Duke Halos, the most powerful and renowned nobleman in the Chester Empire. He enters the room wearing only a robe, since he plans to spend the first night of marriage with his wife. The girl gets nervous and panics because that wasn't in the contract. It all started 3 months ago, when the man to settle her father's debt demanded that they hand over his daughter. Although her father was very worried, the girl was sure nothing bad would happen to her since they still had time. The father happily hugged his daughter tightly and promised never to hand her over to that man under any circumstances. The parents whispered happily about how their daughter had matured and changed since she didn't make a scene. She wasn't rude or angry like she used to be before. From the reaction of Victoria's parents, Elsa realized how badly the real Victoria behaved in whose place she was now. Because she wasn't Victoria Prosi. She simply fell asleep one day reading a book. Elsa woke up as one of the characters in the book. Victoria was just a secondary character and didn't influence the story. Elsa didn't care about that protagonist. Because from her perspective, Victoria's demands were endless, but the man who loved his daughter never denied her anything, and that's how he ended up in debt, and so poor he couldn't resist those who wanted to collect. And now for some strange reason it fell to Elsa to fix all this, and she ended up in Victoria's place. Due to strange circumstances, the girl decided to review all of Victoria's expensive dresses and jewelry to sell them and try to pay off the debts. However, the butler who came to help her at her request informed her that since the items weren't new, they wouldn't get much money for them. Upon learning that the girl wanted to help her father pay off the debts, the butler was very excited since in all his years working in that house he had never seen such kindness in her. Victoria went out for a walk to think about how to get money because selling her things wouldn't gather 80 million. Dreaming of money falling from the sky, suddenly, a paper flew directly to her face. When she caught it, Victoria saw it was an announcement about a missing boy. The missing child was a 5-year-old Leon Halos, and they were offering a reward of 100 million for his return immediately. She remembered that Leon was the protagonist of the novel she had apparently finished just as he disappeared. Victoria was delighted because following the plot she could improve her life. And although she hadn't read the entire story, she knew exactly where Leon was. That's why she ran to the dumpster tearing the skirt of her dress, so she wouldn't get dirty, and started searching for the boy. She was willing to do anything to avoid being poor again like in her past life. Rummaging through a pile of trash bags, she finally found the boy curled up dirty and scared. Looking at him, she had no doubts it was Leon Halos, because his black hair and red eyes were signs of the ducal lineage. Realizing the reward was hers, Victoria became very happy, but she quickly noticed the boy had a high fever. Wrapping Leon with a bag she found right there, she took him home. Surprising her family a lot, Victoria called the doctor, who prescribed medicine for malnutrition, and promised the boy would recover. Sitting next to the now clean boy whose beauty was beginning to shine, Victoria confirmed he was the protagonist of the novel. She was very curious to know why Leon had ended up in the dumpster and if his father and Angel had anything to do with the original story. He had been alone for a long time until he met his beloved, and their romance began when he rested in a country house. There, the girl gave life to Leon, but Ian's father opposed their relationship because she was of humble origin. Only when the father died did Ian go to find his beloved and son, but on the way back, his carriage overturned and crashed. Victoria understood that by being completely alone, Leon ended up wandering until he reached that dumpster. She felt uncomfortable receiving a reward for an orphaned child. Victoria didn't know what to say to him when he woke up, but she quickly pushed those thoughts out of her mind. The girl knew the Duke adored his nephew and would surely take care of him, so she only had to collect her money since the boy had already been taken to the Duke. Several children claiming to be his nephew had been brought, but all those people didn't know that Chester Halos could verify if it was the right boy by giving him a potion that revealed the true color of his eyes. The Duke got angry each time he realized that foolish and greedy people tried to pass off their children as his nephew. Each time this happened, he felt frustrated because he still hadn't been able to see the boy in person, and that's why he didn't know what he really looked like. Upon learning that Leon was the Duke's missing nephew, Victoria's parents sighed with relief, since for a moment they thought he was her child. Victoria's mother gave Leon clothes she had kept since her daughter was little. The girl was surprised by how much her parents cared for their protagonist, since they even kept her childhood things. However, Elisa didn't understand how such good parents could have such a problematic daughter like Victoria. When she entered the boy's room, the girl saw he was already awake, and after asking how he felt, she decided to take his temperature. She touched his forehead and froze, because the boy called her mom. Sitting next to him on the bed, Victoria told him she wasn't his mother, and the boy broke down crying inconsolably. In the original novel, it was said that the boy had lost his memory due to the trauma of the incident, and didn't even remember his mother's face. The girl didn't know how to explain this to Leon, so she simply hugged him and calmed him down, in promising he would see his family soon. The boy was surprised to learn that she wasn't family, and Victoria, introducing herself kindly, offered him to call her Vicky. Leon promised the girl he would eat well and take his medicine on time to recover soon. Although she had bathed him once, the boy still smelled strongly of garbage, so Victoria took him back to the bathroom. After leaving him sparkling clean and dressing him in clean clothes, the girl sat the boy at the table to eat. At first, Leon resisted, but in the end, Victoria managed to convince him to eat by turning the meal into a game. Delighted with the boy, the girl decided to take care of him until he fully recovered. Meanwhile, a man in a cloak and mask was beating his subordinates because they hadn't managed to find the boy for him. Looking at his bloody hands, he gave them a month to find and bring him the boy's body. Victoria took the scared Leon to introduce him to her parents. The man and woman were very saddened to see how adorable the boy was, and were surprised at how much Victoria resembled her mother. At night, when the girl tucked him in, Leon took her hand and asked her not to leave him, realizing that the boy, who had spent so long alone in a dumpster, was very scared. The girl lay down next to him and promised to stay all night. In the morning, Leon brought Victoria's parents a drawing he had made, where they appeared along with their daughter and the butler. They were all very touched because the boy also called them Grandma and Grandpa. The whole family had fun moments with the boy, eating cookies together, reading books, and also going for walks, taking out Victoria's old toys from the attic. When the time came to take Leon to the Duke, Victoria's parents hugged him tightly, not wanting to let him go since they had grown very fond of him. After long farewells, the girl and the boy got into the carriage and set off for the duchy to return Leon to his family. Victoria even felt happy to return him early because if they had stayed together a little longer, they would have grown so attached that parting would be even harder. Upon arriving, the girl was impressed by the magnificence of the palace that revealed itself to her as she crossed the doors. Of course, she knew the owner of the palace was very rich, but every detail inside was worth a fortune. They sat Victoria and Leon on the sofa in the parlor to wait for the Duke. Although the novel spoke of Chester Halos's extraordinary beauty when he entered the room, the girl was struck by his perfection. Victoria was so fascinated that she accidentally said it out loud and became very nervous when the butler went to fetch the magic potion. The girl finally cheered up and introduced herself to the Duke. Leon bowed and shyly greeted Chester, who continued observing the guests in silence. However, the Duke, who knew the girl's story, suspected she had picked up a boy somewhere just to get the reward. Looking at Leon, Chester thought his guess was the worst of all he had ever seen, because no one had ever brought him such a malnourished child to elicit pity. The Duke was even more convinced he was right when Leon said it was Victoria who had told him what his name was. Looking at the girl angrily, Chester demanded she tell him where she had found the boy. Sure, she would make up excuses on the spot. Victoria explained that she found him in a dumpster, and the Duke thought again that she only wanted to provoke compassion. As Leon confessed that Victoria had told him about his memory loss, Chester became even more convinced it was all a lie. The girl got angry since she was sure she had brought the right boy, and the Duke was surprised by her insistence. The butler entered the room with the news that the shelf with the magical neutralizers had fallen and all the bottles had broken. Since it was difficult to obtain the ingredients for the potion, they could only get a new dose within a month. Chester told Victoria they would resume the conversation in a month, and the girl was annoyed to realize that they were treating her like a scammer. Upon learning that many people had arrived at the palace before her, who used magic to change the appearance of their own children, she understood why the Duke was so distrustful, saying he would wait for them to contact her in a month. Victoria took Leon by the hand and was about to leave the room, when suddenly Chester stopped her and demanded she leave the boy with him. Although Victoria was sure the Duke was Leon's uncle, she was surprised by his request, knowing he still considered her a fraud. The boy clung to the girl, crying hard and trembling, and Victoria refused to leave him in the castle. Chester insisted on his demand and promised the reward would be paid without fail once they confirmed it was the right boy. But Victoria couldn't do that, because as long as the Duke didn't recognize his nephew, the responsibility for the boy remained hers. Leon ran happily into the girl's arms because he wanted to go home with his grandparents. Chester and Victoria started arguing again, but a servant intervened and warned them that if she took the boy, both would be in danger. He informed them that unfortunately the Halos family had plenty of enemies. Victoria remembered that in the book. It mentioned that the Halos family had many rivals who committed all kinds of wickedness. This meant that if rumors about them and the boy spread, safety would no longer be guaranteed. She hugged the boy, filled with doubt because she couldn't leave him in the castle with strangers. The Duke, who was watching them, was completely sure that if he kept pressing the girl, her deception would soon be discovered. After thinking about it for a moment, Chester proposed to Victoria to stay that month in the mansion with the boy. A servant named Ron accompanied the girl and Leon to the rooms assigned to them, and the boy was fascinated by the size of the room. Victoria asked Ron to prepare a carriage for the next morning to pick up her things and tell her parents everything in person. Since the boy couldn't be left alone and she had to leave before he woke up, she asked that they send the carriage at dawn. Upon leaving the room, the butler thought the owner of the house believed the girl was a professional scammer. Chester was convinced that Victoria had fallen into the trap and that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. For that reason, the Duke ordered the servant to monitor every step of the girl and keep him informed about everything. Victoria tucked Leon in, convinced that staying was the best for the boy. At dawn, the carriage arrived for her, and as soon as she got in, Victoria fell asleep. It was very difficult to convince her parents that she and Leon would have to live a month in the Duke's palace, but she managed. Passing through the market, which was already full of life early on, Victoria asked them to stop. Upon getting out of the carriage, she looked at everything. They were selling magical objects, food, and all sorts of trinkets. She hoped to find star-shaped decorations, because the night before, Leon, looking at the sky, had wanted to catch a star. At one of the stalls, Victoria saw a beautiful magical sphere that shone as if it had stars, and she reached out to it, but another hand also approached the sphere. And when she looked up, the girl saw Duke Chester. In the morning, the Duke was in his room completely decorated with stars and constellations. Ron entered the room to inform his lord that the carriage was ready. The butler was worried about the Duke's fate, but they both knew this would help clarify the matter of the carriage accident. Chester turned to leave, and Ron advised him not to pass through the market, since the leaders would gather there. Besides, the servant knew that if his lord went to the market, he would buy a bunch of star-themed items again. Without responding, Chester left the castle, remembering his last encounter with his brother. That time, sitting under the starry sky, Ian told him how much he loved his son, the stars, and how he wanted to introduce them. Stepping out into the courtyard and looking at the clear sky, Chester mentally promised his deceased brother he would find his son. Despite the servant's warnings, the Duke ended up in the market, where he ran into Victoria, who in theory should have been at home. The girl told him she had finished her business and had only gone to the market for the sphere. But Chester didn't want to give it up. The vendor informed them that it was the last magical sphere. It began to shine when touched. Victoria couldn't let go of the gift she had chosen for Leon, so she and the Duke started arguing. The girl decided to be clever and distracted Chester, making him turn and took the sphere. Upon getting what she wanted and asking for it to be placed in a gift box, Victoria was on cloud 9 with happiness. Chester, annoyed, couldn't believe that a girl accustomed to luxury could be so happy about a simple toy. When she was preparing to go to the castle, she invited him with a smile, but the Duke thought it was fake. Victoria was hurt that he refused to go to the castle with her, and at that moment, a loud gallop of horses was heard with great noise. A horse pulling a cart charged at full speed directly toward the girl. The horse reared up, the girl flinched, and when she opened her eyes the next instant, she realized she was lying on the Duke directly on the ground, going over what had just happened. Victoria understood it was Chester who saved her, taking her in his arms and jumping aside with her. Upon standing, she watched how the Duke helped the coachman gather the boxes that had fallen from the carriage. Although Chester was unpleasant to her, he thought he was actually a good and kind person. Noticing a wound on his arm, she hurried to offer to treat it, but Chester brusquely refused. Then the girl thought that perhaps she had rushed to judge his good character. Victoria also decided to help the coachman lift the boxes, and at that moment, from the corner, a hooded man was watching them before returning to the castle. The girl thought that since the Duke had ordered them to stay, he should ensure Leon had what he needed during that time. So sitting in the carriage, she happily looked at the boxes with things they had bought for the boy. Suddenly, the carriage stopped, and when she leaned out the window, Victoria saw that the Duke's carriage had broken down. Despite Chester's previous rejection, the girl suggested continuing the journey together in her carriage. The Duke instantly rejected the proposal without a second thought. However, the servant informed him that changing the wheel would take a long time, so he advised the Duke to go with the girl, remembering that Ron had asked him to return soon for a meeting with the Chief of Knights. Chester finally decided to accept, and since they traveled in complete silence, the girl felt uncomfortable because due to the boxes, they had to sit right across from each other. Victoria was also bothered that every time the carriage shook, the Duke's long legs bumped into hers. The Duke tried to cross his legs, but it didn't work, and the girl began to pull hers away, tired of fighting for space. Victoria decided that the best thing was to sleep during the journey and leaned back in her seat. The Duke thought that even now she was pretending, because a moment ago she had been struggling with him with her feet and now she was supposedly asleep. However, upon looking at her more closely, he was convinced she was really asleep and noticed that when asleep she looked like a child. However, he quickly pushed those thoughts away, because if anyone knew how deceptive appearances could be, it was him. He recalled an incident from his childhood, when his father slapped him soundly just because Chester interrupted him while he was talking. According to rumors, his father was goodness incarnate. This recap manhwa follows a girl who, though she only invited her closest ones, married out of convenience to Duke Halos, the most important and famous man in the Chester Empire. But no one suspected how terrible he really was. After experiencing something like that as a child, Chester was sure no one could deceive him. With an innocent facade, he looked at Victoria sleeping and thought again that she was actually pretending. The cart bounced so much over the bumps that the girl hit her head against the window several times, and Chester couldn't understand how she could sleep through so much movement. Unable to take it anymore, he put his hand under the girl's cheek. Sleeping, she took his hand and pressed it against her cheek while he only thought about how strange she was. Meanwhile, Leon, upon waking up and not finding Victoria by his side, ran all over the castle looking for her dodging servants. Noticing the commotion, Ron understood why Victoria wanted to return before he woke up. Seeing the cart approach, the butler was happy because the boy could finally calm down. Upon getting down and opening the cart doors, Ron was surprised to see the Duke next to Victoria, who quickly pulled her hand away when she woke up. The girl felt a strong headache and realized she had been hitting the glass while sleeping. The porter was just about to open the door for the Duke when Leon came running out of the mansion crying out to Victoria without stopping. The boy launched himself into the girl's arms, complaining about being left alone. Ron noticed that the boy was really very attached to the girl, but the Duke ordered him not to lower his guard and watch her. Victoria and the boy entered the room. And sitting on the bed, the boy continued to cry and rubbed his red eyes, pleading through sobs that she never leave him again because without her, he was scared of being completely alone, just like that time in the dumpster. Victoria hugged the boy tightly and promised she would never leave him. Remembering the gift, she jumped up and handed Leon a magical sphere that left him completely fascinated. Pulling the curtains and sitting next to him, on the bed, she pressed the button on the sphere, and the room filled with magical light, and all the constellations in the sky appeared on the walls. The girl told Leon not to worry anymore because this castle was his true home. Now calm and feeling safe, the boy snuggled up next to Victoria, hugging his new toy. She looked at him and sadly thought that soon they would have to part, and she wouldn't be able to keep her promise. The servants of the masked man informed him that the girl who found the boy lived in the Duke's mansion. When he asked them if it was that boy, they only said he had black hair and red eyes. The masked man also learned that the girl who found the boy was Victoria Prosy, a vain young woman about whom rumors circulated. He was furious because the servants had wasted so much time and only brought him news that anyone could hear. In the gossip, he called his assistant Hayden and ordered him to get rid of the useless servants. The masked man only watched in silence, as his assistant eliminated them one by one, making sure everyone was dead and no one would see his face. He took off the bloody mask after that. Hyzen then received the order to obtain the magical stone. Ron informed Chester Halos that according to the gathered information, the incident with the carriage was not an accident. It was now clear someone had planned an attack against Ian, and the Duke was furious, his whole body trembling with the desire to know the names of the suspects. But until they found the surviving boy, it was impossible. Chester suddenly stood up to go meet the Chief of Knights, rejecting Ron's suggestion to call the chief to his office because he wanted to go out for a walk and get some fresh air before leaving. He ordered the butler to find the guardian and bring him before him. As he walked, the Duke thought about who could have attacked his brother, and for what reason. Suddenly, he heard the servants gossiping that Chester had killed his own brother to take the title of Duke. Grinding his teeth in rage, he thought he had to find the real culprit to clear his name. Upon finding the Chief of Knights, Shane Chester ordered him to gather a search party, with the best knights handed him the documents proving the attack against Ian, and suggested Shane take the watchdog as an assistant. They decided to conduct a very thorough investigation, because they could no longer afford to waste time finding the culprit. The Duke ordered Ron to return to the castle, and he decided to take a walk himself. A bit tired of holding in his anger, he let himself fall onto a bench and decided to rest a little before continuing to work. However, he couldn't relax because close by, Victoria and Leon were playing and making a lot of noise. The Duke picked up the ball that rolled to his feet, and Victoria approached to apologize for interrupting his rest. Upon taking the ball from his hands, the girl noticed his injury again. She was annoyed that he hadn't treated it since it could get infected with tetanus. Chester insisted that his hand would be fine, but the girl wouldn't back down because it had all happened because of him. Victoria called the maid and asked her to let Leon spend some time with the other maids and bring her the first aid kit. Chester was just getting up to leave when he noticed this, and the girl told him she hoped he didn't think of running away from the discomfort. He sat back down, taking the first aid kit the maid brought him. The girl smiled at him and offered the Duke to put on the medication. Hesitating a little, he extended his hand, but she, laughing, returned the first aid kit to him so he could do it himself, and ran out, leaving the Duke confused. Night came, and Victoria tucked Leon in, who had already put on his pajamas just to sleep. As the boy was falling asleep, he timidly asked when they would go home together. Hearing that the castle was his home, the boy became sad because he missed his grandparents. Morning arrived, and during breakfast, Victoria noticed Leon was eating without enthusiasm because he still wanted to return home with her. The girl didn't know what to do, and thought about how to distract the boy from those thoughts. She decided to propose going out to see the city, entering a cafe and visiting a toy store. Excited, Leon accepted, and even started jumping with joy around the room, remembering they first needed to ask the owner of the house for permission. Victoria went to Chester's office already expecting him to say no. Even when they were strolling through the garden, the guards surrounded them. While the girl thought about how to ask for permission to go out, Ron approached her to ask what she needed. Finally, Victoria decided to stop worrying about a possible rejection and entered the room. However, she didn't manage to express her request to Chester before he strictly and sharply denied her the exit. Victoria asked him to think again, since the boy was bored being always in the castle. At that moment, the girl noticed the Duke had his hand bandaged and was glad he had healed the wound. Upon the surprised question from Ron, Chester replied that he had healed the wound so Victoria wouldn't worry that he could contract tetanus. The girl began telling the maid how the Duke had asked her to treat his wound and to interrupt her Chester. Brusquely asked if she planned to go out for a walk. Victoria smiled and commented that it could be dangerous for them, but the Duke ordered several bodyguards to accompany them while watching the girl march away happily. Chester thought she was surely a fraud, since she always tried to put him in uncomfortable situations. Leon happily ran excitedly through the streets of the city, accompanied by Victoria and the bodyguards, passing in front of shop windows, eagerly looking at the toys and asking to buy everything. The girl hadn't thought about buying anything, so she looked at her wallet with concern and only found 1,000 shillings. She remembered the pendant she was wearing around her neck that she could sell if necessary. Suddenly, Victoria saw a candy vendor offering his merchandise for only 100 shillings. Upon buying a candy for Leon, Victoria felt a great relief, because the boy was incredibly happy with his sweet. At that moment, a thief attacked a woman nearby and snatched her handbag from her hands. Seeing the thief run towards Victoria and the boy, the bodyguards told them to stay back, to catch the thief. But suddenly the thief turned sharply around the corner and disappeared from sight. Noticing the victim, the guard asked Victoria to wait a moment to check if she was okay. As he approached her, he promised that his partner would recover the stolen handbag. At that instant, the thief reappeared from around the corner and quickly ran toward the frightened Victoria and the boy. The girl scooped Leon into her arms, and at that moment, the thief stumbled and fell flat on his face right at their feet. Leon bent down to pick up the handbag, but the thief jumped up and ran away again. The victim roughly snatched the handbag from the boy's hands, but still, she kindly thanked Victoria for her help. Suddenly, she offered a necklace to the girl as a token of gratitude, but Victoria refused to accept it. Before she could react, the woman threw the jewel at her and quickly walked away, observing the necklace that seemed quite expensive. The girl thought about how strange everything had been, because if you think about it, the thief's behavior and the way he appeared and disappeared was quite odd. Moreover, the lady didn't even greet or thank the guards for their help, but immediately she gave Victoria a reward. For the girl, it was obvious that those two had conspired to give her the necklace. But she thought all of this couldn't bring anything good. At that moment, Leon ran toward a stall, selling all sorts of trinkets. Seeing a large star on the counter, the boy's eyes lit up, and he immediately wanted to buy it. The vendor told him it was the last piece, so he could give it to him at a discount. The girl's heart broke as she thought she couldn't afford to buy what Leon was asking for. Remembering the necklace she had just received, she offered it to the vendor as a form of payment. After examining the stones, the merchant said they seemed fake, but since the design was in fashion, he offered to pay 200,000 shillings for them. Victoria was very happy to have gotten such a large sum, because now she could buy Leon a little star. Then, excited, she announced to everyone present that she wanted to treat everyone to drinks with the money she had left. Trembling with fear, the thieving women who crossed paths with Victoria told the masked man that the girl had sold the necklace. The masked man was beside himself with rage, since those two didn't even imagine how valuable the jewel was. He ordered them to return to the market and recover the necklace at all costs. After dismissing them, he sat down confused because, according to rumors, the girl loved luxury. So it was strange she had sold the necklace. The assistant Hayden, who had heard everything, suggested to his Lord Bill that they handle it themselves. He proposed it would be better to use the magical stone themselves instead of depending on the girl. According to him, it would be much safer to investigate the mansion from the inside, and Bill agreed. Entrusting the task to Jason, Victoria and Leon were sitting in the garden. The girl was giving the boy pastries. He asked, while remembering the necklace he had just received. He offered it to the seller as a form of payment after checking the stones. The merchant said they looked fake, but since the design was in fashion, he offered to pay 200,000 shillings for them. Victoria was very happy to have gotten such a large amount. Now she could buy a little star for Leon. Then she cheerfully announced to everyone present that she wanted to treat everyone to drinks with the money she had left. Trembling with fear were the thieving women who crossed paths with Victoria. They told the masked man that the girl had sold the necklace. The masked man was beside himself with rage, since those two didn't even imagine how valuable the gem was. He ordered them to return to the market and retrieve the necklace at all costs. After kicking them out, he sat down confused because, according to rumors, the girl loved luxury. So it was strange that she had sold the necklace. The assistant Hayden, who had overheard everything, suggested to his master Bill that they handle it themselves. He proposed that it would be better to use the magic stone themselves, instead of relying on the girl. According to him, it would be much safer to investigate the mansion from the inside, and Bill agreed. Assigning the task to Jason, Victoria and Leon were sitting in the garden. The girl was giving cakes to the boy, and the Duke was watching them from the window. Assigning the task to Jason, Victoria and Leon were sitting in the garden. The girl was giving cakes to the boy, and the Duke was watching them from the window. Ron informed him that so far he hadn't seen anything suspicious about the girl, and that she was very kind to the boy. He told him that during that misunderstanding at the market, she first worried about the child's safety. Besides, Ron said that while watching the Baron's family, he found out that their butler had returned and resold all the luxury items that Victoria had accumulated. Ron noticed that the girl was not at all what the rumor said and assumed that she had simply matured. However, the Duke still thought the same, believing that people don't change so easily, and Ron suggested that if you repeat a lie enough times, it starts to seem like the truth. Stepping away from the window, Chester ordered the butler to remain vigilant and keep watching, no matter what happened. Ron accepted the order but thought to himself that no matter how much he watched, he saw nothing suspicious in the girl. Victoria was playing hide-and-seek with Leon, her favorite game, and the boy crawled under a chair. Taking advantage of the girl getting distracted, the boy came out from under the chair to find a safer hiding spot. Seeing Ron coming toward him, Leon grabbed him by the leg, pleading for him to hide him better. The butler took the boy to the kitchen, where at that moment the cook was cleaning the floor. The man asked the boy not to run so fast, because the floor was slippery and he could fall and hurt himself while running. After Leon, the cook, slipped and fell to the ground, and the butler went after him. Ron managed to grab hold of a shelf, but accidentally knocked over a sack of flour that fell on his head, and the boy started running happily between the men, imagining that the flour was snow and that they were playing snowballs. Meanwhile, Victoria, who couldn't find Leon anywhere she went, she ended up entering the library. The girl was fascinated by the number of books neatly arranged and looked in awe at the huge shelves in this Recogió manhwa. Chester was reading a book by the open window when suddenly he heard a creak upon seeing a book that caught his attention on the highest shelf. Victoria dragged the ladder over there with effort to reach it. The book was about how to turn 10,000 shillings into 100 million, and thinking the Duke wouldn't buy useless nonsense, the girl wanted to read it. Victoria began to daydream that by reading the book she could indulge herself for the rest of her life. While making a clumsy movement, she twisted her ankle and fell off the ladder. As she fell, Victoria closed her eyes and suddenly realized that despite the fall, she felt no pain for some reason. When she opened her eyes, the girl discovered that Chester, who had come to help her, was holding her in his arms, embarrassed by how fast her heart was racing at seeing how handsome the Duke was. Victoria asked him to put her down. She thanked him for saving her, but Chester only stared at his hands in silence. Pretending he didn't hear her, Victoria apologized for entering the library without warning and explained that she was looking for Leon, saying that she already knew the boy wasn't there. The girl turned around and left through the door. While still staring at his hands, Chester thought that Victoria was too careless to be a con artist. Realizing that he had been thinking about the girl's innocent face for a while, the Duke got angry with himself. Seeing the book that Victoria had left behind, he couldn't help but laugh because he had thought about throwing that silly little book away. Understanding that the girl was so happy because she thought she would get rich thanks to that book, Chester burst into uncontrollable laughter. Victoria was walking down the hallway, annoyed with herself because her heart was still beating fast, when suddenly she stopped upon hearing Leon's laughter coming from the kitchen. When she entered, she saw how well the boy was having fun with the cook and Ron, and was surprised to notice that they were all covered in flour. Victoria picked Leon up in her arms and he immediately fell asleep exhausted from all the play. Night fell and Hazel approached the castle transformed into a cat, recognizable by her different colored eyes. The cat jumped out of the bushes right in front of a knight, who was yawning, dreaming of finishing his shift and going to sleep. Seeing the cat, the guard turned around, and feeling sentimental, decided to accompany the animal to look for its owner. Looking directly into the knight's eyes, the cat, which wore a red medallion around its neck, suddenly shone with an intense light. The next instant, using the magical power of the stone, Hassan took on the form of the guard. Chester was walking quickly to meet Shane, who was arriving with the report, anxious to know the results of the investigation. However, Shane apologized, as although the knights carefully searched the entire way from Burney to the capital, they found nothing. Chester thanked the knights for their efforts and sent them to rest. Shane offered to return to extend the search, but the Duke insisted that the knights rest. Ron shared with Chester his opinion that the murderer planned everything so well that even the search team couldn't find any clues. Embracing his loyal guard dog, the Duke decided to take a walk with him since he didn't want to confine the dog. Just after he had worked so hard to leave, Chester asked Ron to order the cook to prepare a special dish for Guardian when they returned. Key, who was supposed to protect Victoria, learned that the plans had changed and now had to patrol the mansion. While walking with the guard dog, Chester apologized for having to confine him, since there were guests in the mansion. The Duke remembered how he and Ian had taken care of the puppy since he was born and hoped that if the boy turned out to be his nephew, he would definitely introduce him to the dog. Leaving the dog waiting at the door, Chester entered the castle and headed to the dining room. Seeing that Victoria and Leon were having lunch, the Duke stood at the entrance and wondered if it would all be like this when he had his own family. Noticing Chester, Victoria asked him if he had eaten. He replied that he hadn't, and the girl thought he looked quite confused, but since they had already seen him, the Duke decided it didn't make sense to escape. At that moment, the chef entered the dining room. The chef asked Chester if he correctly understood that the special dish was raw chicken, and the Duke nodded upon hearing this. Victoria was surprised by the Duke's strange tastes and thought she would also feel uncomfortable if anyone else found out. Assuming that Chester wanted them to leave the dining room so he could eat in peace, the girl stood up to leave the room. The Duke noticed that Victoria was so busy feeding the boy that she hadn't eaten and suggested that she finish her meal calmly, but the girl refused and quickly got up, inviting Chester to start eating, taking the chicken prepared for the guardian from the chef's hands. The Duke noticed that Victoria was watching him from the corner, unable to hold back. She told him that he better not eat raw meat. The girl assumed that the Duke might get food poisoning and that to take care of Leon he needed to be healthy. Chester was shocked for a few seconds until he finally understood that the girl thought he had taken the meat for himself, and burst out laughing watching Victoria walk away, thinking it was becoming more interesting to be with her. Entering the kitchen, Ron discovered that the cooks were commenting that the Duke, who had been so sad, had laughed a lot. The chef couldn't believe it, and even went back to the dining room to make sure that the Duke had really laughed. The chef had never seen anything like it in his entire career working for the ducal family, and Ron wondered what could have made the master laugh so much. After eating, Leon was always full of energy and ran all over the yard, so Victoria feared he might fall. Ignoring the girl, the boy ended up falling, but quickly got up and continued playing. Suddenly, he turned and ran toward the forest, disregarding Victoria's pleas not to wander too far. When chasing after him, the girl heard the boy's scream, and pushing through the bushes saw that he was crying inconsolably. Leon was sitting on the ground, and towering over him was a huge and terrifying dog that had scared him a lot. The boy couldn't calm down because the dog was getting closer and closer. Victoria ran to help Leon and, hugging him tightly, protected him from the dog with her own body. The Duke arrived, running and shouted at the dog not to move, and the animal, whimpering, stayed still in front of the girl. Chester tied the dog to a tree and apologized to Victoria, since he hadn't thought they would get so far into the woods. The girl let herself fall to the ground because the nerves had left her weak. The Duke ran toward her, and Victoria felt embarrassed for always falling when he was near. When the Duke asked her if she was hurt, the girl replied that Leon was fine. Chester got very upset because he wasn't asking about the boy, but about her. Hearing the screams, Ron came running, worried, and Victoria told him that nothing serious had happened to her. However, the girl couldn't stop trembling in her legs and realized she had no strength to get up from the ground. Leon was very worried about Victoria and couldn't stop crying, but the girl reassured him, telling him she would soon stand up. The Duke handed the kicking boy to Ron to help the girl under the surprised gaze of the butler and Leon. Chester picked up Victoria in his arms and ordered Ron to call the doctor to his room. While watching them walk away, the servant wondered why the Duke had carried the girl if she had said she would get up soon. After examining Victoria, the doctor told the Duke not to worry and informed him that the girl only had a slight sprain. He promised that if they put ice on her leg and didn't push her for a few days, everything would heal without problems. After dismissing the doctor, Chester sank into the armchair next to the girl's bed. Victoria thought she had already had 2 opportunities to feel like a princess in his arms and wanted him to leave soon, because she felt uncomfortable every time she remembered how everyone looked at her when the Duke carried her to the bedroom. Chester apologized to Victoria for not having tied up the guardian, since even though he was obedient, he was still dangerous. The girl hurried to assure the Duke that she understood it was all an accident, and that the dog was just protecting its home. Chester promised to make up for her injury and do whatever she asked, and Victoria, laughing, asked him if he would buy her a mansion, taking her joke seriously. The Duke immediately asked what kind of mansion she wanted. The girl, laughing, replied that it was enough for her to meet the guardian. Chester went out into the hallway where Ron and an anxious Leon were waiting, who couldn't wait to see Victoria. Taking the boy in his arms, the Duke calmed him and asked him not to worry, promising him that the girl would recover soon. He asked Leon to behave because that way Victoria could rest and recover faster. The boy promised to fulfill the task, jumped from the Duke's arms, and quietly went to another room. Ron, smiling, commented that the Duke was very worried about the girl. After a brief silence, Chester turned to the butler and ordered him to find the antidote as soon as possible. Suddenly, he realized that he had judged Victoria too quickly, and that if it was all a misunderstanding, he needed to clarify it as soon as possible. The servants gathered in the kitchen were commenting on what had happened with the dog and how brave the girl was for protecting the boy. Regina, one of the maids who overheard the conversation, thought that Victoria just wanted to win over the Duke by using the boy. She found it very strange that Victoria had found the boy in a dumpster, since no noble lady would have gone in there. They all looked at each other and decided to wait for the antidote to arrive, so that the truth could finally be revealed. The head maid entered the kitchen and got angry with those present because they were chatting instead of working. Regina saying that she had already finished, the head maid's errand asked for permission to rest for a bit. Upon learning that the cook was preparing soup for Victoria, Regina offered to help him. While serving the soup onto the plate, she thought that if Victoria kept chasing the man she loved, she wouldn't have a future. The protagonist was sitting on the bed, and Leon wouldn't let her get up to get water. The boy jumped off the bed to give her a drink himself, and walking slowly, brought the glass to her to not spill a drop. Leon was so worried about the girl that he wouldn't even let her take the glass, and helped her drink with his own hands. Victoria thanked the boy and hugged him, promising not to get sick again. She thought sadly that only a few days were left before they would be separated, and that she would like to hug him tightly for the rest of her life, embracing the boy and petting him. Victoria thought about how much she would miss her little hero. The maid brought food to the room and Victoria and Leon sat down to have lunch. Upon tasting the first spoonful, the girl noticed that the soup was very salty, but Leon devoured his portion delighted. Victoria thought that someone had simply spilled salt by accident, and since no one was dying from it, they finished quickly. Night arrived and transformed into Key. Hayes approached the door and pulled a long claw from his finger, inserting it into the lock to open the closed door, without difficulty. Upon entering and going down the stairs, Hayden took a stone that ignited with a bright red flame. From the stone, a red fire sphere emerged through which Bill ordered him to stop and report the situation. Hayden reported that he had noticed in the boy some features resembling those of the Halos family, and that the antidote had not yet arrived at the castle. Upon receiving this information, the master ordered him to keep watching and to notify if anything occurred. Recovering from her illness, Victoria finally went out to the garden and couldn't stop admiring the sky. At first, the girl was a bit annoyed when the maid suggested she could have looked at the sky from her room's window, but then Victoria burst out laughing because she understood that attentive Leon wouldn't let her peek out the window in this recap manhwa. Smiling, she thought about how Chester could doubt her relationship with the boy since they were similar even in character. Victoria enjoyed the tea and every breeze after so many days locked up. Noticing that it was quite cold outside, she jumped up to go fetch herself a cloak, draping a shawl over her shoulders, and just in case took a sweater for Leon. Before leaving the room when going down the stairs, she suddenly stopped thinking that they had seemed wide before, but now she had gotten used to them as if she were in her own house. Remembering that the boy was probably already waiting for her, she ran outside and suddenly the Duke called her. Victoria thanked him for worrying about her health and noticed that a dog was peeking out behind him. Seeing the dog, the girl was delighted and hurried to meet the guardian. Chester told her that the dog had prepared something for her and stepped aside from the dog, which kept wagging its tail. The Duke stepped away from the dog, and the girl saw that it was approaching her with a flower in its mouth. Upon reaching her, the dog dropped the flower at Victoria's feet, and she, thanking him, picked up the gift. Asking Chester for permission, she slowly approached the dog, and the guardian confidently bowed down, allowing her to pet him. Embracing the dog, Victoria thought about how long it must have taken the Duke to train him, since the animal couldn't have done that alone. Thinking that Chester had that sensitive side, she looked at him and noticed that his expression had softened. Realizing that she was staring too intently, the girl stood up suddenly and said she had to go. Seeing the dog whimper, Chester was surprised, thinking that he himself was also sad about Victoria's departure. The next morning, the Duke observed from the corner how the girl was feeding Leon with a small spoon. The cook, who suddenly appeared, offered the Duke to join them for breakfast, revealing Chester's presence. Responding brusquely that he was just passing by, the Duke turned around and quickly left. Victoria asked the cook if the Duke would join them and learned that he had been watching them from the door since then. The girl began to notice that Chester was watching her everywhere. The Duke seemed to appear by chance, wherever they were, whether in the garden or in the palace. It even seemed like he accidentally entered the library when Victoria was reading books to Leon. One day, while serving tea to Victoria in the garden, T noticed that something amused the girl greatly. Victoria whispered in the maid's ear to look behind the tree. T turned around and saw that the Duke was behind the tree watching them from there. Because of this behavior, Victoria thought that the Duke still considered her an imposter and was watching her for that reason. However, the maid believed that this assumption was not correct, since there were always many guards around who could do it. The maid suggested to Victoria that she ask him directly what it was about, as maybe he wanted to tell her something but didn't dare. While the girl thought about whether she should talk to Chester, he himself didn't understand why he was doing that, always appearing out of nowhere. Ron asked the Duke if he wanted to talk to them as he noticed how Chester was looking at Victoria, embarrassed and blushing, and the Duke replied brusquely, that he was just walking around. When turning to leave, he ran into Victoria, who was behind him, and proposed to join their game. However, the Duke responded sharply and categorically that he would not. Then the girl asked him why he was watching them, if he didn't want to play, as it seemed to her that he wanted to play with Leon. Chester insisted that he was just walking around his lands and wasn't following anyone. At her pretense, Victoria commented ironically that, sure, she believed him. Once again, they started arguing, but Ron appeared between them, trying to calm them down. Suddenly, someone patted Chester on the leg, and looking down, he saw Leon inviting him to play. The Duke was startled by Victoria's angry voice, who told the boy that Chester was busy and couldn't play with them. Looking at the girl and crouching next to the boy, the Duke agreed to play with him. The Duke justified his change of decision by saying he couldn't refuse a child. A minute later, Ron watched with pleasure as the three happily played ball. After the game, Leon invited Chester and Victoria to his room, promising to show them a treasure. The Duke, who had been in the yard for a long time, was in a hurry to get back to work, but the boy started crying. Not wanting to make the child feel bad, Chester agreed to play a little longer with him. Seeing them, Victoria thought that the Duke had a very gentle nature, since his nephew could manipulate him. While sitting Chester in an armchair, Leon handed him a magic sphere that Victoria had gifted him. The Duke immediately recognized that object, for which he and Victoria had argued at the market that first morning. The girl told Chester that what Leon loved most in the world were the stars, and remembered how Ian had told her how sweetly her son smiled when looking at the starry sky. Noticing how attentive and surprised Chester was watching Leon, Victoria thought that he was doubting again that he was her nephew. The girl wanted the Duke to become friends with her nephew before leaving, so she decided to encourage him to do so, telling him how the boy had cared for her devotedly while she was sick. To finally win over the Duke with the charm of the little one, she asked Leon to sing to Chester a song about a little star. Victoria accompanied the boy singing, and the Duke noticed that he couldn't take his eyes off her. He began to rub his eyes hard, and the girl thought that Leon's song had moved Chester to tears, hoping the Duke would congratulate the boy. Victoria asked him if he wanted to say something, but Chester couldn't utter a word because he felt his heart pounding hard at seeing how beautiful he thought the girl was. Trying to control himself, he praised the boy in such a serious tone that Victoria and Leon shrank under his gaze. The next instant, Chester jumped from the chair and ran out of the room, while Leon became sad, thinking that he hadn't liked the song. The girl hugged the boy tightly, trying to comfort him, and without understanding what was happening to the Duke again, whom she almost considered a normal person. Upon leaving the room, Chester hit his head against the window, convinced that he was going crazy, and at that point he was found by a surprised Ron turning around. The Duke suddenly decided that he urgently needed to train in the yard and ran out. A carriage, pulled by white horses, arrived at the palace with a creak, helping the red-haired girl get down from the carriage. Her servant commented that it was rude to arrive uninvited, but she replied that with the relationship she had with the Duke, that wasn't necessary. Throwing open the doors of the mansion, Casey immediately entered, looking for Chester. Leon was sitting with Victoria in the dining room, waiting for his favorite chocolate pudding. At that moment, they heard Casey's unfamiliar voice looking for Chester all over the house. Upon rushing into the dining room and seeing strangers, the girl apologized because she didn't know the Duke had visitors. The maid informed that Chester was training in the yard, and upon hearing his name, Victoria was left thinking, as she couldn't remember that character in the book. Fixing her gaze on Leon, Casey suddenly shouted and ran toward him, grabbing the boy by the cheeks. And looking closely, she was happy that they had finally found Leon. With her enthusiasm, she scared the boy so much that he cried, running to Victoria. Petting the boy, the girl calmed him down, telling him he didn't need to be afraid. When Casey assumed that Victoria was Leon's nanny, the girl suddenly remembered her in the novel. Casey Reynolds was the only daughter of Count Reynolds. Victoria recalled that Chester's father and the Count were great friends. They often visited each other, so their children also became close, which is why Casey called Chester her older brother, without any shame. However, in person, that behavior seemed to Victoria more rude than spontaneous. Observing Victoria closely, Casey thought she was too young and pretty to be a nanny. Noticing that the girl had a good eye, Victoria introduced herself and explained that for certain reasons, she was living for a while in the Duke's mansion. Upon hearing the name, Victoria continued, and Casey was surprised that the extravagant lady she had heard so much about was standing in front of her. She hurried to apologize for her words, but Victoria told her she hadn't been wrong, even though everything was different now. Casey began calling her Vicky immediately, which she didn't like at all since they barely knew each other. After searching a bit in her bag, Casey pulled out a gummy bear and gave it to a very happy Leon. Victoria wondered in surprise how such a big bear had fit in such a small bag. Noticing her gaze, Casey thought that Victoria liked the bag and decided to gift it to her. She insisted that she accept the gift, since from that small bag anything could be taken out. Casey asked her to accept the gift, as thanks for having forgiven her rudeness. The girl looked at the boy with admiration, convinced that he resembled Chester so much. Victoria said she was completely sure that he was the Duke's nephew Halos and that no antidote was needed. Upon learning that Victoria had brought the boy, Casey ran toward her with questions, eager to know all the details. While training with the knights, the Duke defeated them all in sword fighting, and Ron, who approached him, advised him to rest, a bit thinking that the knights might misinterpret his attitude and believe he had come to settle the score for his failure in the search. But the Duke told the butler he was only trying to sort out his thoughts while putting away Chester's sword. Ron informed him that Miss Casey had arrived at the castle. The Duke froze for a moment, but as soon as he learned that Casey had spoken with Victoria, he ran out immediately, Chester was hastily heading to Victoria's room despite Ron asking him to stop and invite Casey to the hall. However, knowing Casey's character, Chester couldn't afford to lose a minute. Ron thought the Duke feared Casey would tell Victoria dark stories from his childhood, but he only asked her not to bother him. The girls were sitting in the room chatting while having tea with pastries, saying it was now her turn to ask. Casey asked Victoria if she knew what nickname Chester had as a child. Going over various memories in her mind, Victoria couldn't think of anything but Icicle and Grumpy approaching her. Casey told her that as kids they called Chester Talentless Face, and Victoria burst out laughing. Victoria was having so much fun with Casey, feeling like she was with her best friend. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and Chester, panting, poked his head in to apologize for interrupting the chat. He dashed toward Casey, asking her what had brought her there and noticing her anger. Victoria thought he had heard them laughing at his nickname. Just as brusquely, the Duke called Casey to the hall to talk about the reason for her visit. Leon, scared by Chester's unexpected arrival, thought he was angry with him for something. Victoria hugged the boy tightly and calmed him down, explaining that he hadn't done anything wrong. Once seated in the hall, Casey insisted that she had only come to visit her little brother, whom she hadn't seen for a long time. Chester, cold and cutting, asked her why she had been talking about him with Victoria. Casey kept insisting that none of that had happened. Noticing his furious gaze, she decided to change the subject and began talking about Leon's discovery. Chester told her he wasn't sure that was the boy, since he had checked everyone using the antidote. But Casey was convinced that Victoria wasn't a liar, although Chester thought there was nothing wrong with being cautious. The girl began to defend Victoria, believing she was a good person incapable of deceiving. Upon learning that Casey had even already given her the nickname Vicky, the Duke put his hands to his head, not understanding why he was suddenly so much on her side. But the girl wouldn't stop talking about how kind, attentive, and pretty Vicky was. Suddenly, Chester confessed that he already knew all that, without anyone telling him, leaving Casey very surprised. The Duke wondered why every time he looked at Victoria, everything around him lit up with a bright light. Thinking that he had problems perceiving reality, he decided to go to the doctor to find out the cause of his illness. Victoria was pulling out one toy and then another along with candies from her magic bag, which had Leon completely fascinated in this Recogió manhwa. Taking advantage of the fact that the boy was distracted with the toys, the girl let herself fall on the bed, as she hadn't been able to sleep well from taking care of the little one. Noticing that Victoria had fallen asleep and not wanting to wake her, Leon, tired of playing alone, went out to look for someone. Upon leaving through the door, he discovered that the castle was completely empty and there was no one around. Thinking it was a game of hide and seek, and that he had to find everyone who had hidden, he started opening all the doors. One by one, upon opening another door, he entered a spacious room and stood frozen in the doorway, as if he had been frozen. The entire bedroom was decorated with stars, constellations, and anything related to celestial bodies. Upon opening his eyes and realizing he had fallen asleep, leaving Leon playing alone, Victoria jumped out of bed. Not finding the boy in the room, she ran out to look for him, scared that he might have gotten lost along the way. She encountered T, who calmed her down and suggested they look for the boy together. Chester was walking furiously down the hallway, replaying the conversation with the doctor in his head over and over. Knowing that the symptoms only appeared when he saw Victoria, the doctor had told him it wasn't a psychological issue, and he had started laughing strangely. The Duke was very annoyed that the doctor found that funny, and suddenly he stopped, realizing that without noticing he had arrived at Victoria's room. Thinking that his doctor was a fraud, he turned around and quickly headed in another direction. Ron, passing through the hallway, saw Victoria, crying, standing there. She turned to him with red eyes from tears and told him that Leon had disappeared, asking for his help. She admitted that she had dozed off for a moment, and when she woke up, she noticed the boy was gone. Ron told her not to worry, promising to find Leon. Approaching the room where he wouldn't let anyone in, Chester frowned. Upon seeing that the door was open, he burst the door open, ready to catch the intruder and pounce on him. But inside the room was Leon, sitting on the floor, hugging a little star to his chest. Chester, surprised, couldn't understand what the boy was doing in that room. Leon, still smiling and hugging his toy, happily told him that he had found the room where the little star lived. Chester was paralyzed, not understanding why he couldn't ask the boy to leave the room he had prepared for the real. Leon. Looking at the boy, he thought about how well that room suited him. While Leon happily invited him to play the Duke, accepted to play for a while with the boy, and Leon happily settled him next to him on the floor. Chester asked him why he was alone and not with Victoria. The boy confessed that the girl had fallen asleep and he didn't want to wake her, but he got bored being alone upon hearing Victoria's name again. The Duke felt uncomfortable since lately she kept appearing everywhere. Chester couldn't understand why she kept coming to his mind. Even when he was going to sleep, the doctor hadn't said anything clear to the Duke, and he was so tired of it that he decided to avoid anything related to the girl Leon suggested to Chester that they sing, so he wouldn't get bored while Victoria slept. And the Duke laughed and agreed. The boy hugged his toy and started singing the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star song. that he had sung last time hearing it, the Duke imagined Victoria again and couldn't understand what kind of illusion that was. Meanwhile, Victoria was searching for Leon all over the mansion, along with the servants running with Ron toward the second hallway, where there were many rooms. She couldn't calm down thinking that something had happened to Leon, and her eyes filled with tears. Suddenly, one of the doors opened, and Leon popped out with a cheerful shout waving at the girl. Victoria ran to him, picked him up, and hugged him tightly, happy that he was okay from the commotion. In the hallway, the Duke came out of the room behind the boy. He realized again that he was staring at the girl. Intently for a long time, everything around him lit up, and he quickly forced himself to stop doing that. Victoria apologized for the ruckus and explained that everyone was looking for Leon and had been very scared for him. Noticing that she was genuinely worried, Chester admitted that it was his fault because he knew the boy was alone. But he didn't think it would scare Victoria so much. The girl suddenly stood up, turned her head, and almost fell to the ground. But Chester managed to catch her, and she ended up back in his arms. Ron assumed that, like last time, she had gotten too flustered, and that's why she was out of strength. Chester said that the girl needed to rest, and she felt embarrassed because she always ended up falling onto the Duke, noticing that Victoria still seemed weak. Chester opened the door to a room so she could rest there without having to go to her bedroom. Leon entered with that girl into the room, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing upon noticing that the whole room was decorated with stars. Days later, sitting in the garden with a cup of tea, Victoria thought that she wanted to go home soon since Leon was getting along well with everyone in the castle and she could leave him in their care. Plus, knowing that the boy was the Duke's real nephew, she was sure he would be fine in the mansion. She remembered how Ron, when entering the star room, told her that the Duke had personally bought all those decorations. Since Ian had told his brother how much he loved stars, his son Chester decided to decorate the room. He had prepared for him upon hearing all of this. The girl remembered how annoyed Chester was when he couldn't get the star sphere. Anyway, the girl knew that now she could be at ease, and all she had to do was get the money and leave the castle. Victoria felt sad because she wouldn't see all those she had gotten accustomed to. So much she knew that they wouldn't stop her if she wanted to see Leon. But she also understood that she could no longer intervene in the story, where the protagonists were already defined. Feeling a great sadness, Victoria decided she needed to cheer up and eat something sweet. To lift her spirits, she declined T's offer to bring her a cake, deciding to go herself for the sweets. And leaving the maid playing with Leon jumping off the table, the girl ran to get her magic bag. Passing through the garden, she suddenly heard the servants whispering about the Duke, and she started eavesdropping on their conversation. The servants were commenting that the Duke's carriage accident had been planned by Mr. Chester. They said he did it to get the title, and that his investigation to find the culprit was just a facade. The girl got angry hearing all that nonsense, and stepping out from around the corner, she glared at the servants, demanding they confess immediately who had told them such nonsense. Just before this, Chester was in his office working and feeling very tired. Decided to take a break. He approached the window, and opening it, looked out to the garden where Victoria was hanging out with Leon and T once more. Chester realized he couldn't take his eyes off the girl, the Duke, who had left the castle to stroll among the trees. Just when Victoria went to get sweets, he was glad to clear his mind a bit, although he knew he had to get back to work suddenly. Chester noticed that without realizing it, he was heading toward where Victoria and Leon were leaning against a tree. He couldn't understand why he couldn't do anything against that obsession. Suddenly, he heard the servants whispering while talking about the rumors about the carriage accident just as the Duke was about to turn back to return to the castle. He heard Victoria's voice coming from the bushes defending him. She scolded the servants for spreading absurd rumors about the Duke without any proof. With anger in her voice, she forbade them to talk about the subject again, assuring them that Chester hadn't done any of that. Seeing all this, the Duke felt how his heart thumped hard in his chest. Suddenly, he stepped out from behind the trees and asked Victoria if she hadn't been walking in the cold wind for too long, scaring everyone, saying that he truly was cold. The girl turned to go back with Leon, but Chester, who was going in the same direction, followed her, thinking that what he had heard might have bothered him. The girl turned and asked him, however. He confessed that the rumors didn't interest him at all, which surprised Victoria a lot. She didn't understand how he could stay still and quiet, being innocent, because in her place she couldn't sleep easy, tilting her head. Chester asked her where she got so much confidence in her innocence, as the girl couldn't tell him the truth about the book she had read. She just admitted that she saw him as a completely different person. Victoria was sure that if Chester were a criminal, he wouldn't have bothered to decorate the room for his nephew. Looking into the girl's green eyes, the Duke's heart started beating treacherously again and his face turned completely red. Regina was listening to how the maids were discussing what happened in the garden and got angry because the imposter had scolded them. The maids were sure that a girl who cared so much for Leon couldn't be an imposter, but Regina was still convinced that Victoria was trying to seduce the Duke, who according to her belonged to her. The cook prepared a soup for Victoria since the night before. The girl had gotten very cold walking with Leon. When Thea brought the bowl of soup, she bumped into Regina at the door, who got mad at her for her carelessness. The girl was upset because she felt that since the guest arrived at the house, all of Thea's chores had fallen on her. Regina thought that Victoria was pretending to be sick on purpose, because she had seen how a few days ago Victoria made a fuss looking for the boy just to be carried in arms. When entering Victoria's room, Aunt found Leon crying next to her, convinced that the girl was dying. Victoria smiled and asked that the boy be taken for a walk so he wouldn't catch anything. But in the end, Aunt managed to take a kicking Leon out of the room so that Victoria could rest. The girl was lying thinking that soon she would have to part from the boy, so she didn't have time to stay in bed. In his office, Chester was reviewing books, trying to find the cause of his illness after reading a stack of novels. The previous night, he finally understood that he had simply fallen in love. He didn't quite understand what had happened, but he knew that despite the rumors, Victoria was completely different. She simply couldn't be so extravagant. And unscrupulous as to use a child for her own benefit, suddenly the butler entered with some documents for the Duke to sign, which Chester did after collecting his thoughts. Suddenly, the Duke decided to ask Ron why he loved his wife. Upon realizing what it was about, the butler became even more convinced that his suspicions about Victoria were true. Annoyed that Ron was joking, Chester demanded an answer to his question. The butler said that to love you don't need reasons, and that although the first impression might be one, over time feelings and attitudes toward a person change upon hearing all this. Chester understood that there could be no more doubts. He was in love. Suddenly there was a knock at the office door, and Thea announced that Leon wanted to speak with the Duke. Leon rushed to hug Chester and through tears told him that Victoria was dying. Thea hurried to calm the situation, explaining that the girl only had a cold and had taken the boy for a walk, so the lady could rest upon learning that Victoria was alone resting in the room. Ron understood that it was a great opportunity for the Duke, the butler called him, and whispered in his ear that it was the perfect time to go pick flowers. Chester waited anxiously behind the corner of Victoria's room, waiting for Ron and not understanding what he was doing. There, the butler arrived and handed him a bouquet of freshly cut flowers from the garden. He fixed the Duke's shirt and sent him to the girl. Ron asked Chester to trust the experience of a married man and advised him to be kinder, because girls like that Victoria, with a strong headache, couldn't sleep. And that's why she was tossing and turning in bed when she heard a knock at the door. She greeted the Duke with a smile, because although her whole body hurt, she didn't want him to see her in that state upon entering the room. Chester, as usual, shot a piercing look at the girl and received an equally sharp one in return. Ron, who was behind, pushed his boss, reminding him to be courteous. Victoria was surprised to see the bouquet of flowers in the Duke's hands and asked what it was, but Chester replied brusquely that he had only come to give her the flowers. Ron sat on the floor holding his head because the way the Duke spoke couldn't be called exactly kind. Seeing that they needed to save the situation, the butler sent Thea to the room with a glass of warm water. Chester took the glass and handed it to the girl, telling her that these flowers were good for the cold. If prepared in an infusion standing next to Victoria, the Duke began to pluck the petals from the flowers, one by one, and throwing them into the glass. Looking at him, the girl thought that she definitely liked that character, and that even those little gestures were pleasant because sometimes he seemed so attentive. But suddenly Victoria wondered why they were doing all this, since Thea's arrival had clearly been planned. Chester promised that after drinking the infusion, she would feel better, and asked her to do it, thinking that it would disguise the warning that she shouldn't infect Leon. Victoria just said aloud that she would try not to overexert herself. Chester didn't understand why the girl had gotten angry, and while she drank the infusion, he told her that he knew he did that to protect Leon, noticing that his boss was left dumbfounded. By that unexpected turn, Ron intervened again to save the situation. He rushed into the room, grabbed the Duke by the shoulders, and took him away, pretending they had important matters to attend to upon returning to his office. Chester was annoyed, not understanding why Victoria reacted like that to his concern. The butler noticed that maybe it was because Chester, for a long time, thought she was a scammer and treated her coldly because the Duke treated her like that for so long. Now the girl found it hard to believe in his sincerity. According to Ron, they just had to wait for that mess to finally resolve. Meanwhile, Heisen realized that it made no sense to keep using Kai's appearance, since the commander wanted to send him to investigate. It was clear that as soon as Heisen joined the search party, he would stray from the true objective that couldn't be allowed. So Jason decided to recover his true form. Kay was very surprised that the commander called him, since he had just been assigned to protect the boy. The commander ordered him to join the search party in a new expedition, since the knight himself wanted to participate in the investigation. However, the boy didn't understand why he was being called. If only the best were sent to the search, the commander was surprised that the boy rejected for the second time. The opportunity being offered, as Heisen left the office with a glint in his eyes, he jumped high to a tree. Pressing the stone on his neck, he removed Kai's appearance and dropped it from the tree, knowing that if he suddenly disappeared, it would be suspicious. He returned the boy to his place, erasing his memories of the trap in this recap manhwa. After finishing that this time, Jason decided to use another approach. Victoria was having tea with Casey, telling her about all the things she had sold to save her family. The girl got up to close the balcony door, where a draft was coming from since she still hadn't completely recovered. Suddenly, a big white cat jumped onto the railing, scaring the girl a lot with its appearance. After recovering from the scare, Victoria realized that in front of her was a cute, fluffy kitten with different colored eyes. Leon was so fascinated with the cat that he asked the girl to keep it. Casey tried to pet the cat, but it suddenly scratched her, and it hurt quite a bit. Victoria suggested to Casey to leave the cat alone, and continued chatting upon noticing that the cat was watching. Leon decided to approach to pet it. However, the cat jumped into the room and settled right. In Victoria's lap, the girl got nervous, but then petted the cat, who was happy to have achieved what he wanted. Chester couldn't stay still knowing that Casey had arrived at his home, and for some reason went straight to Victoria. Fearing that the girl might say something inappropriate, he got up to check it out. He found Ron at the door, who had arrived with an urgent message for the Duke. Although Chester ordered him to come back later, Ron informed him that they had brought an antidote sample to the palace, handing the Duke a small vial. The butler said it was only enough for one dose. The wizard managed to find a vial and immediately sent it to the castle so they wouldn't wait for the rest of the order upon taking the potion in his hands. Chester thought that even if they used it to clarify everything, the result was evident. That's why. The Duke ordered not to tell Victoria anything for now, and to inform her in 5 days when everything ordered would arrive. Ron understood that the Duke didn't want Victoria to leave the castle too soon. When he asked if he should return the potion to the wizard, Chester replied that they weren't going to delay the test. The Duke went to find Leon and asked the butler to prepare a drink and wait for them in the star room. Chester entered Victoria and Leon's room. As always, Leon rushed joyfully to hug his leg. Saying he came for the boy, the Duke suddenly noticed the cat with different colored eyes. In Victoria's lap, upon looking closely, the Duke shot her an angry and threatening glare. Hyzen, disguised as a cat, shivered as he felt that Chester had already discovered everything upon noticing that the Duke really looked so intimidating, as the rumor said. Hyzen decided to pose as the most harmless cat possible, thinking that Chester was angry because Victoria brought the cat without permission. She apologized and explained that the cat had jumped in through the window. Upon stepping out onto the balcony, the Duke wondered where the cat had come from. Since the trees were quite far from the window, the girl assumed that maybe the animal belonged to someone in the mansion. But Chester didn't know anyone who had a cat in the castle. Victoria proposed to take care of the cat while they searched for its owner. But the Duke immediately refused to justify his refusal. He said that Ron was allergic to animals. Then Victoria thought that she had no choice but to take the cat home. Imagining the girl spending time and hugging the animal, Chester felt jealous and firmly forbade that. To Victoria's surprise, he said he would ask Ron to find the animal's owner. The girl reminded Chester that just a few minutes ago he had said the butler was allergic. And seeing the Duke trying to get out of the bind, Casey burst into laughter, unable to hold back the girl's teasing. The Duke grabbed Leon and, saying he had an important matter with the boy, ran out of the room. Casey couldn't stop laughing because she was starting to suspect Chester's feelings for Victoria. That's why she decided to ask the girl what she thought of the Duke and what she thought of him as a person amidst laughter. Victoria replied that to her he was just an ordinary man, with a lot of money, walking down the hall with Leon in his arms. Chester thought that Casey had clearly noticed something, and that now he wouldn't be free from her teasing. Seeing the Duke blush, the boy thought that maybe he was in pain. But Chester calmed Leon and told him they were going to the star room. As an excuse, he decided to use the star-shaped decoration he had recently bought for the room, hugging the Duke tightly. The boy told him that he loved him as much as the stars. Chester remembered how, while sitting in the garden, Ian had told him that a child is not just a fragile creature. The brother promised that someday, Chester would also discover how Leon has that incredible ability to make you smile, just by looking at him, remembering that. And hugging the boy, the Duke smiled at him tenderly. Suddenly, Leon started smelling Chester, and said that he had felt that scent before somewhere. Suddenly, a very vivid memory struck him. The boy couldn't distinguish the faces, but he saw someone with a similar smell leaning over him. Those memories caused Leon a sharp headache, and he grabbed his head, crying scared. The Duke ordered Ron, who had just arrived, to call the doctor. Immediately, the doctor didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, and the butler suggested that maybe the boy's memories were returning. When asked if it could be related, the doctor replied that a sudden headache was a worrying sign, because when memories return, it's normal to suffer from intense headaches, saying that the boy could only be helped with medicine and observation. The doctor gave him a painkiller after thanking and dismissing the doctor. Chester offered Leon, who was crying, a spoonful of the remedy, but he didn't want to take it. The Duke promised the boy that if he took the medicine, then they would go together to see the stars encouraged. Leon asked if they could also take Victoria, and Chester agreed. Hugging the boy tightly, he promised that the three would go to see the starry sky, and then he took the remedy. Leon started crying again because the medicine was bitter, and Ron, laughing, offered him the sweet juice he already had prepared. After drinking it, Leon became sleepy, and Chester, after laying the boy down, was about to leave the room. He was at the door when suddenly Ron congratulated him because they had finally found the boy. He told to surprise Chester that the drink he gave Leon had an antidote. Looking at the boy in astonishment, the Duke was convinced that he really was his nephew. Casey prepared to leave without even saying goodbye to Chester, who, as she noticed, had been avoiding her. Victoria couldn't understand what had passed her by, which is why Casey started saying strange things. After the Duke left, suddenly Aunt ran toward her, and upon learning that Leon was sick, handed the cat to the maid and ran out very worried. Realizing that she might miss some information, Jason slipped from Thea's hands and ran after Victoria. The girl rushed into the star room and saw the Duke sitting next to the bed where Leon was sleeping. Chester told her that the boy's memories had returned, and that was probably why. His head hurt upon knowing that it wasn't just a cold. Victoria was happy and sighed with relief. Suddenly she noticed something strange in the Duke's behavior, in the way he smiled tenderly holding the hand of the sleeping boy. Seeing that he was too serious, Victoria decided to ask if something had happened. Staring at the girl, the Duke suddenly apologized to her, admitting that all this time he had acted very rudely and had distrusted her, thinking that something strange was happening to the Duke, for saying that Victoria suggested calling a doctor to check on him. But Chester interrupted her, and with a serious gesture assured her that he was fine and that it wasn't a joke at that moment. Leon woke up holding the Duke with one hand and stretching the other toward Victoria. The boy, smiling, said that his head didn't hurt anymore and that he was fine, which made Chester and Victoria very happy. The boy asked the girl to lie down next to him to sleep together. However, Victoria knew that Chester had thought of every detail of the room for his nephew, and that the Duke wouldn't let the boy stay there until he recognized him as Leon. But against all odds, the Duke stroked the boy's head and suggested they stay in the room. He said goodbye and asked to surprise Victoria to let him know if they needed anything, however. Leon stopped him and asked him to lie down next to him so that Chester and the girl would be on either side of him, unable to refuse his nephew. The Duke accepted, and along with Victoria lay down on the bed. The girl was moved that Chester stayed with Leon, despite having many things to do, and thanked him for taking care of the boy all day with those conversations. The Duke realized that his heart was beating fast again, so he decided to change the subject, however. After a minute, Chester noticed that Victoria, just like Leon, had fallen asleep without expecting it. He reached out and stroked the girl's hair. Upon realizing what he was doing, he turned and tried to fall asleep quickly, to not think about anything. Meanwhile, sitting on the ledge, Jason watched them, not fully understanding what was happening. Victoria and Leon were happily playing in the yard, while Chester watched them from the window of his office. Suddenly, the door creaked behind him, and turning, the Duke saw Ron in the doorway. Upon noticing the dark circles under his master's eyes, the butler got very scared and immediately wanted to know what had happened. Upon understanding that the problem was related to Victoria, Ron tried to find out what it was. If the young lady had already accepted his apologies, Chester regretfully confessed that he was worried that Victoria showed no interest in him. He recounted that night when the three slept together in the same bed, his heart was pounding and he couldn't sleep, painfully realizing that the only person Victoria loved was Leon. He only cared that for her, there didn't seem to be a place for him in her heart. The desperate look on his master's face made the butler laugh, and Chester, annoyed, asked him what he had come for. Ron informed the Duke that Count Cedric Drake had come to visit him shortly thereafter. He was sitting in the parlor chatting animatedly with the Duke. While they had tea in his father's name, the Count thanked Chester for helping in the process of signing the agreement with the imperial family. The Duke stood up and asked Cedric to leave if he had nothing else to say. The Count stood behind Chester, who ignored him, surprised that he was so busy, as to not have a minute to talk. Suddenly, as he approached the window, he stopped, seeing a girl, whom he recognized immediately as Victoria. Turning around, the Duke asked Cedric if he knew the girl, but he replied that he only recognized her from sight. Since she was famous in society for her extravagance, the Count was very curious to know what Victoria was doing on the Duke's property. However, Chester coldly replied that it was none of his business, which clearly angered Cedric. Cedric assumed that the girl had come for money, presenting the boy he brought as if he were the Duke's nephew. Chester only coldly responded that Cedric was talking nonsense, but he tried to justify himself, saying he was nervous. The Count had heard that Victoria's family had gone into debt because of him and was on the verge of bankruptcy. He also commented that the only way to pay off debts for a girl who only had a pretty face was to win the favor of some rich aristocrat as a mistress. Laughing, Cedric advised Chester to be careful with Victoria, since he had enough money and she could take advantage of that. Unable to endure those words any longer, gritting his teeth, the Duke ordered the Count to repeat what he had said. Cedric, without suspecting anything, didn't finish his sentence when Chester grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and with rage in his voice ordered him not to cross the line, declaring that Victoria was not at all like the Count thought. The Duke pushed him with such force that Cedric fell to the ground. Cedric honestly didn't understand why he had fallen so low in the Duke's eyes just for what he said about that girl. In response to his bewilderment, Chester just shot him a furious look and ordered the Count to get lost before he cut off his head, running out of the room. Cedric, offended by that treatment, promised himself that he would never forget that day. Indignant, Chester ordered Ron, who had just entered, to break all ties with the Duray family, which surprised the butler a lot. Observing through the window, Leon was waving at him. The Duke asked the butler not to pay attention to what had happened, smiling and waving at the boy. He asked him to find out how much money and to whom exactly Victoria owed. He looked at her, thinking that even if she didn't choose him, he wouldn't let her go with another just because of debts. That night, after bathing the boy, who was no longer afraid of water, Victoria was trying to catch him to dry him, but he wouldn't stop running around her. Thea, laughing, said that if he kept running so fast, he would dry himself without needing a towel, which made Victoria laugh. After wishing the girl good night, the maid was about to leave, but suddenly, as if remembering something, she headed to her. Then, as if changing her mind, she abruptly said goodbye, closed the door behind her, and left. Victoria stood there confused, not understanding what exactly the maid wanted to tell her about the next day upon seeing Leon drink warm milk before bed. She suddenly understood what Thea wanted to tell her after all the next day they had to bring the antidote to the castle. Looking at the boy, she thought sadly that there was only one day left before they had to part. When Leon finally lay down, he timidly asked Victoria if they could sleep again with Chester like that day. Sure, that this time. He snored and felt embarrassed in front of the Duke. The girl didn't want to repeat it and promised Leon that they would do it next time. Hugging the boy tightly, she promised to fulfill his wish in 2 days. However, in her mind, Victoria was apologizing for having lied to him so shamelessly, since in 2 days, she wouldn't be in the mansion with tears. In her eyes, she hugged the most important person to her, whom not long ago she had saved just for the reward. The butler brought the antidote to the Duke and suggested postponing the test for a few more days. But Chester refused, because a deal is a deal, and it must be honored. Timidly knocking on the door of Victoria and Leon's bedroom, Chester swallowed nervously and announced that he was going to enter. Upon seeing the antidote, the girl expressed her hope that it wouldn't have side effects. Chester assured her that everything would be fine, and Victoria woke Leon upon seeing the glass in the butler's hands. The boy happily launched toward his favorite juice, but Chester suddenly stopped him, realizing that he had shouted. Unintentionally, the Duke was frantically searching for an excuse for his reaction. Scared, Victoria ran toward the Duke and whispered once again if the drink was safe. Chester got angry because the girl didn't trust him, and again, they started to argue in front of a surprised Ron and Leon. The Duke didn't know how to explain to the girl that he just wanted to delay her departure. He hadn't finished justifying himself when Leon, smiling, announced that he had finished his juice, which was delicious. Worried, Victoria rushed toward the boy to ask if he felt anything, but he reassured her, saying that everything was fine. Chester reminded him that he had already said the test was safe. With a smile, he told her that now everyone could see that the boy was the Duke's nephew. Victoria was glad that Chester recognized Leon as his nephew, and he thanked her for her help following Victoria's advice. Leon ran happily to hug his uncle and squeezed him tightly. The girl was genuinely happy that everything had been resolved, but Ron noticed that tears were falling from her without wanting to. Although Victoria was doing everything she could to hide her tears, Leon got scared when he saw her cry. She desperately tried to remember something nice to stop crying, but Leon was already running towards her to see what was happening. The Duke offered a handkerchief to Victoria, but the more she dried her tears, the more she cried a little calmer. She desperately tried to remember something nice to stop crying, but Leon was already running toward her to see what was wrong. The Duke offered Victoria a handkerchief, but the more she wiped her tears, the more she cried. A little calmer, the girl knelt in front of Leon and asked the surprised boy to obey his uncle while hugging Victoria. He didn't understand why she was giving him advice. When he finally realized that the girl was saying goodbye and was thinking of leaving, Leon broke down crying and begged her to take him with her. Unable to keep watching the boy cry, Victoria asked the Duke to take him away. By order of the Lord, Ron took Leon in his arms, but he clung to the girl's dress. Asked the Duke to take him by order of the Lord. Ron picked up Leon in his arms, but he clung to the girl's dress and accidentally tore the bow from the sleeve. Seeing Victoria tremble, the Duke ran towards her, and she asked him when she would receive her reward. Chester promised to write her a check right away. The girl apologized and said she would go home right away, asking to have the check sent along with her things. She thanked the Duke for everything and was about to leave when he suddenly stopped her. Chester apologized again to Victoria for misunderstanding her and for his disrespect. The girl smiled through tears and said it had just been a misunderstanding, but she was glad. Looking at her, the Duke felt that strong pang in his heart again. Seeing Leon crying again, Victoria, unable to bear it any longer, apologized and ran out of the room. Realizing he couldn't leave it like that, Chester asked Ron to calm the boy, and he himself went after the girl. He ran after her into the hallway and stopped her, grabbing the cuff of the sleeve from where Leon had torn it. Knowing he couldn't force her to stay, Chester suggested checking her hand to buy time. He sat Victoria on the sofa in the living room and left the room to look for medicine. Pressing the Duke's handkerchief against her nose, the girl began to cry, even more thinking of the people she would have to say goodbye to. She jumped in surprise when Chester returned with the first aid kit and a glass of water in hand. The Duke offered to help her with the bandaging, but the girl declined and asked him to pass her the kit. Realizing that the sleeve was preventing her from reaching the scratches, Victoria, without thinking too much, ripped it off in front of a surprised Chester. After finishing bandaging her hand, Victoria told the Duke they could keep talking. Knowing that all this time he had held her back without a real reason, Duke Chester couldn't think quickly about what to say to her. He knew that if the girl left, Cedric's words would come true, so he decided to hold her back, even if it meant lying. Victoria looked at the Duke in surprise, not understanding why he seemed so insecure. Suddenly, she was left speechless with surprise when Chester proposed to marry her. Hearing his question for the second time, the girl thought the Duke was drunk or sick, not understanding how someone in their right mind could propose something like that. She said she refused, sighing deeply. Chester asked if she really disliked the idea that much. The girl didn't understand why she was supposed to want to marry him when they weren't even in love. And those words hurt the Duke. Clearing his throat, he told her he was doing it for Leon because the boy was having a hard time. Without her, Victoria knew Leon needed her, but she couldn't understand why the Duke needed her gathering her courage. Chester decided to confess his feelings to her, but just as he said the important words, the girl sneezed loudly, blowing her nose. She apologized and asked him to repeat what he had said. The Duke didn't respond to that, but admitted he wanted to adopt Leon. Although he was afraid he couldn't do it alone from what he heard in this recap manhwa, Victoria concluded that Chester wanted to marry her only for his nephew, because if a man and a woman lived together without being married, rumors could start. She understood why Chester needed that, but still rejected the proposal, since she didn't want to marry without love. Bowing, Victoria asked the Duke for permission to leave, but he asked her to think about it one more time. Realizing that the girl was about to leave forever, Chester shouted that if she married him for a year, he would increase the reward tenfold. Upon hearing that, Victoria suddenly stopped and the Duke's heart froze. Turning to him, the girl asked, smiling, if she could call him dear from now on. Only with Aunt Ron's help did he manage to get the tearful Leon to sleep. He thanked the maid for her help and asked her to take the boy's things to the starlit room. Realizing that Leon was the Duke's real nephew, Thea felt very happy all of a sudden. The girl remembered and asked the butler if Victoria had already left because she hadn't been able to say goodbye to her. Ron was left thinking, because if the Duke went after the girl to accompany her, why had he not returned yet? In Chester's mind, only the image of Victoria hugging him and calling him dear was there. But the girl pulled him out of his dreams and reminded him that they still hadn't finished signing the contract. The Duke's heart started racing treacherously again, and he tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a contract. Victoria couldn't understand what was going on with his expression and thought the Duke was disappointed, due to her interest in money. However, she knew that with 1 billion shillings, she could not only save her family, but also live the rest of her life without depriving herself of anything. She was also aware that in a year, she would be a divorced woman. But that didn't concern her since she didn't plan to remarry. Suddenly, Victoria wondered what the Duke gained from the contract, because he was not only spending a fortune, but also marking himself as divorced. Thinking that Chester was doing all this for his nephew, she once again thought that in the end he was too good. Upon finishing writing, the Duke handed her the contract for her to review and tell him if she wanted to change anything. The agreement stated that the marriage would be valid for a year and that each one must fulfill their role. If either needed a partner, they must notify the other, at least 2 days in advance. And on the day the contract ended, Chester committed to giving Victoria 1 billion shillings. Smiling, the girl noted that 1 billion shillings was a lot of money. The contract stated that its contents could not be revealed to anyone, and that it could be extended indefinitely if both agreed. Upon reading this, Victoria proposed to remove the last clause, since it was not possible to extend the contract forever. Startled, the Duke turned around and refused to eliminate that part of the contract. Victoria decided to ask if the contract would be nullified, in case someone couldn't keep the secret, knowing that if that happened, they could no longer proceed with the contract. Chester was left thinking. After reflecting a bit, he added a clause stating that whoever broke the agreement had to actively cooperate with the proposal of the other party. After finishing writing, the Duke suggested to the girl that she think a little more before signing, but she told him she had already made up her mind. Chester recommended she think it over and make a final decision, noting that it was a magical contract, and that if it was broken, they could be very harmed, even though it wasn't fatal. Without a second thought, Victoria signed the document and handed it to the Duke. Getting up from the table, they shook hands, and Chester promised to take care of Victoria, and she responded in kind. The protagonist told the Duke that she first needed to go home, and he asked when she would return, laughing. The girl explained that to keep the secret, everything had to seem credible. She thought things needed to be done properly, but Chester didn't understand what she meant. Victoria, laughing, told the Duke that he needed to meet her parents. Finally, upon understanding what she meant, Chester blushed and, slapping his face, refused. Count Humphrey was sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper when his daughter Selina suddenly burst through the door and entered the room shouting. Annoyed by her lack of tact, the Count ordered her to behave. Only after that did he explain the reason for her arrival. Leaning against the back of the sofa, the girl sweetly told her father that she had already decided what she wanted for her 19th birthday. However, the Count reminded her that the gift topic had already been closed and, surprised, asked what she wanted now. Selina smiling, the girl asked her father to invite Duke Chester to the banquet for her birthday. Victoria knew that the marriage was fake and that it wasn't necessary to meet the parents, but she didn't want to hurt those two people who only had their daughter. However, she understood that they wouldn't be able to bear the idea that the marriage was just for money. The girl confessed to Chester that she didn't want to sadden her parents and asked him to maintain the illusion that everything was real. Once again, she asked him to pretend during the dinner with her parents that he loved her. The Duke was quite uncomfortable with the fact that Victoria thought he would have to pretend. When saying he wanted to buy a gift for her parents, he asked what they liked. Victoria said a small, heartfelt detail was enough, and the Duke decided to ask Ron for advice. Chester informed the girl that they would go see her parents in 2 days. Victoria asked him to lend her a carriage and before leaving decided to visit Leon. Stopping her, the Duke put his jacket over her shoulders and explained that it was cold and windy outside. Chester, completely blushing, asked Victoria to be careful on the way. Looking at him, for a moment the girl thought the Duke simply didn't want to say goodbye. Ron, upon entering, was very surprised to see that Victoria was still in the castle. Upon learning from the butler that Leon was in his room, the girl thanked him and said goodbye. Victoria, smiling, thanked the Duke for the jacket and promised to return it the next time they met. While watching her walk away, Ron couldn't understand exactly what she meant by that. Smiling, he thought the Duke had invited the girl on a date. Gathering courage, just as Victoria was leaving, the excited butler began to speak non-stop and offered Chester to help him organize his first date. However, he interrupted him abruptly and ordered him to find out about the wedding hall. Grabbing the Duke by the shoulders, Ron began shaking him, trying to explain to him that you can't book a wedding hall for a first date. The Duke calmed the butler and told him he needed the hall for a wedding, not for a date. But Ron couldn't believe it, since Chester couldn't make decisions like that on his own, even if he really liked Victoria. With an ironic smile, the Duke asked the butler to calm down and explained that the girl had her own reasons. Realizing that Ron thought Chester wanted to forcefully marry her, the Duke nearly strangled him out of anger. The butler understood that the Lord had placed some condition on Victoria, but he remained silent. Ron decided he would guide the Duke during the preparations for the wedding, and he agreed. However, the only thing he thought about was how to prevent the girl from going out with someone else, since this wasn't a real marriage. Observing him, the butler noted surprised how blinded his master was by love while dreaming of Victoria. Leon woke up suddenly and broke down crying bitterly when he didn't find her by his side. Crying, he ran to the window, not understanding why the girl had left him. Peering out the window, the boy saw the cat wandering in the yard, the same one that days earlier had jumped onto his balcony. Victoria returned home with a bunch of gifts for her parents. The touched relatives received the souvenirs with tears, noticing how beautifully they were wrapped. As it was already late and Victoria was very tired, she decided to go to sleep. However, her parents didn't want to let her go. They wanted to know how she had said goodbye to Leon and how he would be without her once again. Realizing how good her parents were, Victoria told them the boy would be fine because the Duke would be a good uncle to him. The girl's parents felt sorry that it would now be difficult for her to see Leon interrupting them. The girl ran up the stairs and wished them good night, throwing the Duke's jacket over the back of the chair. She fell onto the bed and buried her face in the pillow. Turning to look at the jacket, Victoria thought that the next day she would have to tell her parents about the wedding, holding her head, not understanding why everything was so chaotic and why she felt like a sole daughter. Jason was wandering through the garden looking for a secluded spot where he could regain his original form. He knew he had gone too far and reached out to the pendant. With so much security around, it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Using the stone, he called his master and informed him that Leon was that boy. Bill ordered them to bring the boy alive or just kill him on the spot. After receiving the order, Heisen suddenly noticed he wasn't alone in the garden. Turning around, he realized with horror that behind him was Leon, who had left the house following the kitten. Upon seeing the boy in time, Heisen transformed into a cat, so quickly that the boy didn't notice anything. Leon happily approached the cat, while Hayden couldn't understand what the child was doing out at that hour. Annoyed, the cat turned around and began to walk away quickly from the boy. Leon ran after the cat but tripped on a stone on the ground and fell. Seeing the boy, crying, Heisen couldn't understand how someone so foolish could have Duke's blood. He turned to go somewhere quiet, from where he could observe everything that was happening. Leon began to cry bitterly and begged the cat not to leave him like Victoria did. Upon hearing that the boy was afraid of being alone, the cat suddenly stopped and turned back to him, rubbing his face with his muzzle happily. Leon hugged the cat tightly and thanked him for coming back. Inside, Heisen advised the boy not to get his hopes up, because he had only returned to prevent people from hearing Leon's cries. In reality, he didn't care about the child's tears, simply that contact didn't affect his mission. Suddenly, Heisen heard they were looking for Leon and tried to wriggle out of the boy's arms so he wouldn't be found. From among the bushes, Chester, Ron, and Thea appeared paralyzed with astonishment upon seeing Leon. When they took the boy home, Thea apologized for having left him unsupervised, thinking he would sleep until morning. Chester, in response, told her dryly to put Leon back to bed. Looking closely at the cat, Thea recognized it as the same one that had jumped onto her balcony a few days earlier. The boy said that since Victoria wasn't there, the cat would live with him, and seeing how the animal tried to escape the maid, thought Leon had brought it forcibly. The Duke explained that the boy didn't want to return without the cat, and ordered Thea to take care of both until their owner appeared. Jason was completely horrified at the idea of staying with the boy. After putting the boy and the cat to bed, Thea suddenly remembered she had to tell Leon that Victoria would be back soon. Upon hearing this, he was very happy, and not believing his luck, asked the Duke if it was true. Smiling, Chester confirmed what the maid said and explained that the girl had only returned home for a while. Approaching, the Duke, Ron, informed him that they had brought the object he had requested to the castle. The butler handed the owner a magical control, capable of detecting any object and limiting its movement. Ron pointed out that if they managed to distract the cat, it wouldn't be able to leave that place for the rest of its life. After receiving the order and taking advantage of CA going out to get milk, Ron took care of putting the plan into action. The butler showed the boy something on the ceiling, and both he and the cat looked up. Taking advantage of their distraction, Ron quickly put the magic control on the cat's collar. Ron laughed while Leon, horrified, watched how the cat, realizing it could no longer become human, ran across the bed. The Duke commented that this little gadget would stay on the cat until they found its owner. C entered with warm milk for the boy, and Chester and Ron left the room reassured that Leon was no longer in danger. The Duke nonetheless ordered the butler to remain vigilant. He also asked Ron to put a swing in the yard for the boy, so he would have a place to play and not feel alone. The butler promised to fulfill the request, thinking to himself that although the Duke seemed cold, he was actually very attentive. The next day, guests arrived at the Duke's castle in a luxurious carriage. A blonde girl named Iris Henneron presented herself before the Duke, making a polite bow. Chester was surprised at how much she had grown since the last time he saw her in this recap manhwa, as she had been a baby then and now was 5 years old. Herman apologized for having made the Duke wait so long, but the Duke understood perfectly. The man was very happy to know that Chester's long-lost nephew had finally appeared and shared his joy with his daughter. Smiling, Chester noticed that Iris was very reserved, unlike how she was as a child, and now she resembled Sylvia. Without responding, Herman asked the Duke to allow the girl to explore the surroundings of the estate. Upon arriving in the garden, Iris was fascinated by its beauty, the number of trees, and the fountains. During the walk, she saw a swing, and Ron suggested she get on it. At first, the girl refused, saying swings were only for little kids. Realizing that due to her mother's illness, Iris was acting like an adult, Ron began to convince her that swings weren't just for kids. The butler sat her on the swing, and while swinging, the girl began to laugh happily. Suddenly, Leon appeared annoyed because some stranger was using his swing. While having breakfast, Victoria reviewed all the documents related to her family's debts. She wanted to go to the bank with her mother, but she thanked her and said she could do it alone. Her parents assured her they didn't want Victoria to overexert herself, since she had been away from home for a long time. The girl thanked her parents for taking care of her and said goodbye to them. Upon being alone, she thought about how she hadn't managed to bring up the topic of the approaching wedding. Supporting her head, in her hand she promised herself that when her parents returned, she would talk to them about it one way or another. Meanwhile, Leon, grabbing the rope of the swing, shook it furiously for the girl to get down. He was angry because she had already played on the swing, while he hadn't even been able to sit. The maid pushed Leon away, who was kicking, explaining to him that he couldn't behave like that with the guests. Iris got off the swing, saying she was done playing. She rejected Ron's proposal to keep playing, explaining that the little boy wanted to get on. Upon hearing this, Leon turned red with rage and started yelling at her that he wasn't a little kid. However, Iris insisted and tried to prove to him that he was much smaller than her. Seeing that a fight was about to break out between the children, Thea decided to take the boy into the house. The maid suggested Leon go to the room to play with the star sphere. Hearing this, Iris advised the little one to go play with his toys as soon as possible. Leon, angry, dragged his foot hard and filled the girl's shoes with mud. Iris's eyes filled with tears, and furious, she threw a handful of mud at Leon's face. The next instant, after staring at each other for a few seconds, the children lunged at each other and began to fight. Chester and Herman watched in horror as the children got all dirty and angry with each other. Ron apologized to the Duke for not having supervised them properly. The father leaned toward the girl and asked her what was wrong. Iris complained that Leon had dirtied her shoes, that her mom was sick, and that they had to come to that mansion. The Duke looked sternly at Leon to know why he had used the mud, and the boy began to tremble with fear. The nephew began to justify himself, saying he hadn't done anything wrong, that Iris was the first one to get on the swing that the Duke had made for him, and that she had then insulted the ball Victoria had given him. Chester knew Leon valued that ball as a treasure, and that he could have genuinely gotten upset about it. Taking the boy in his arms, he patted him on the back to calm him. Saying goodbye, Herman apologized for all the commotion, even though they hadn't seen each other for a long time. But Chester replied that both children had behaved badly and that he didn't need to apologize. As Leon fell asleep, Herman promised that next time they would apologize, and the girl asked the Duke for forgiveness. Chester replied that Leon was also to blame and that he would also apologize to Iris. The friends finally said goodbye, and the Duke wished them a good trip, remembering that Chester had talked about marrying. Herman congratulated him and advised him not to let the bride get away. Upon hearing about the wedding from someone else, the Duke suddenly realized he was really going to get married. Chester was sitting in his office meeting one by one with those trying to sell him something. Some, for example, offered to invest in the mansion, others in the wine cellar, and others in a clothing store. Chester asked Ron for advice on which of all the proposals was best, and he recommended thinking carefully before deciding. But the next moment, the Duke surprised the butler by saying he wasn't planning to invest. He was just choosing a gift for Victoria's parents. Laughing, Ron threw all the sellers out the door, leaving Chester completely confused. Approaching the owner, the butler jumped on him, explaining that even a small amount of the Duke's money could make them uncomfortable. He explained to Chester that the news of the wedding was already too shocking and the money could cause a real misunderstanding. But the Duke had no idea what he could give Victoria's parents in that case, so the butler advised him to buy something small and simple. Chester spent the whole day thinking about what that gift could be. He couldn't sleep, turning over the idea that the Baron's family might come to hate him if he didn't come up with something. Just thinking that they might not like him made the Duke's body start to tremble. When Ron entered Chester's room in the morning, he found him already dressed and with dark circles under his eyes. The butler realized that his lord was very worried about the gift and feared he wouldn't be liked by Victoria's family. Ron was surprised that Chester was already ready to leave since it was still too early for the meeting, but the Duke could no longer stay in the castle. He felt he would go crazy from overthinking, so he decided to go for a walk, buy the gift, and go to the Baron's house. When he finished getting ready, he asked the butler if he looked good and received an affirmative response. Ron sincerely wished Chester luck and promised him that everything would turn out fine. After receiving the butler's approval, the Duke thanked him and left the castle. Meanwhile, Victoria's parents, upon hearing of the upcoming wedding, were shocked by what they heard. They couldn't calm down since the girl had suddenly decided to get married, even though she had no suitor. But Victoria asked them not to worry, assuring them she had thought it through well, and that the Duke was actually a good person. She tried to convince her father that she was no longer a child and could get married. But the Baron refused to give his permission no matter how much Victoria tried to convince him. Seeing that she wasn't able to convince him, the girl reminded her father that he and her mother had gotten married when they were both 20 years old. They were still arguing when the butler entered the room and announced that Duke Chester had arrived. Hearing this, Victoria ran out and went to meet the Duke, who had arrived 2 hours earlier than agreed. Stepping into the street, she closed her eyes, dazzled by his appearance, though she was mentally trying not to say anything. Victoria couldn't help but exclaim, captivated by his charm. At that moment, the Baroness appeared at the door and suggested to Chester to come into the house. Seeing that the Duke was accompanied, the woman kindly invited them to enter. Rosalie remembered that she had forgotten to introduce herself to the Duke, and smiling hurried to correct her mistake. The Baroness went to find the father and asked Victoria to accompany the Duke to the living room. Being alone, the girl asked him why Chester had arrived so early. The Duke remembered how he had left home early to clear his mind and rest after a sleepless night. Then he went to a store to buy a gift for her parents. However, even after finishing his stroll, he still had a lot of time left. So while waiting with the carriage in front of the mansion, the butler suggested he go in, fearing that telling all this might make it seem like he had nothing to do. The Duke lied, saying another appointment had been canceled. Victoria explained to the Duke that everything was fine, only that he had chosen an inopportune moment to arrive. She confessed to him that she had just told her parents about the wedding, and that they had immediately refused. Suddenly, the Duke moved in close to the girl and, gently hugging her, leaned towards her and brought his hand to her cheek. Both of their hearts raced, and Victoria didn't understand why he was so close. The girl abruptly pulled her hand away, feeling terribly uncomfortable. Chester explained to Victoria that she had turned red and that she just had a hair stuck on her face, and he wanted to take it off. The girl was embarrassed by her own thoughts, but the Duke looked so incredible that she couldn't stop thinking about him. Victoria explained that she looked at him like that because she was nervous about his arrival. The Duke thought she looked strange, but the girl, smiling, told him that style suited him very well. Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's father, Baron Aidan Prosier, who entered the room with a serious face. They all sat in the living room, one across from the other, and the girl noticed how annoyed her father was. The Baron's whole body was so tense that it looked like he would never relax. Chester and Victoria's father stared at each other, exchanging polite phrases in low voices. The girl asked the Duke to do something to relieve the tension because their wedding plans could fall apart. Chester cleared his throat and told the Baron that he didn't come empty-handed on his first visit, but with a gift. He ordered the servants to bring the gift, and they placed 2 small boxes on the table. Upon opening them, the Duke said it was a small, heartfelt gift and hoped it wouldn't be a burden for Victoria's parents. When the box opened, everyone was almost blinded by the shine of the stones inside. On a velvet cushion were lined blue diamonds, sun tears, and also roses, blessings from Chernisha. Victoria had heard that they were the most expensive stones in the world, and was surprised that the Duke thought such a gift didn't commit her to anything. The Baron slammed the box shut and asked the Duke to take the gift and leave his house. Crossing his arms, Aidan declared that his family was not that rich, and that they didn't need the Duke's donations. Chester tried to explain that by giving them those diamonds. He didn't want to imply that, but the Baron interrupted him and said he didn't intend to sell his daughter for a few stones. Chester swallowed nervously, his whole body trembling and covered in sweat. He couldn't understand what he had done to be so disliked by the Baron's family. and if he had known beforehand, he would have asked Ron to arrange for a good gift. Regaining his composure, and not wanting to give up so easily, he asked Victoria's father what he would like to receive from him as a gift in that case. But in response, Aiden asked him to take the box and leave his house. Noticing how the Duke was becoming discouraged, Victoria realized he wasn't precisely a master of persuasion. Looking at him, she understood that she needed to help Chester before he was thrown out for good. The girl hurried to assure her parents that the Duke was not disrespectful. He was just trying to make a good impression. Noticing that Chester was doing nothing to play along, the girl placed her hand over his. Her heart began to race, and accepting her words, she squeezed his hand between hers. She didn't understand why she held on so tightly, or why she had that strange expression on her face. Rosalie looked surprised at the hands of the Duke and Victoria, while the Baron was beside himself with rage at seeing the girl's hand trapped in his. The Duke smiled, embarrassed, and turned red as a tomato upon noticing this. The Baroness also smiled and asked Victoria to step out of the room for a moment. Rosalie explained to her daughter that they needed to talk with the Duke, but the girl was afraid to leave them alone, thinking Chester might say something silly. However, the Duke, now calmer, convinced Victoria that everything was fine and asked her not to worry about him. Victoria bowed and left, and Rosalie asked her husband not to be so harsh and for everyone to speak calmly. The woman sat Aiden beside her, and he with a serious face asked the Duke why he and Victoria had decided to get married. Chester understood they were giving him a chance, and that meant everything was not yet lost. Straightening up and sitting properly, he firmly told the girl's parents that he loved their daughter. The Baron wanted to know how long it had been since they confessed their feelings and when it had all started. Thoughtful, the Duke admitted that at first he didn't like Victoria, as unpleasant rumors were circulating about her. He believed them judged the girl, and truly came to doubt her. However, the more he got to know her, the more he realized the rumors were false. To step out of the room for a moment, Rosalie explained to her daughter that they needed to talk to the Duke, but the girl was afraid to leave them alone, thinking that Chester could say something silly. However, the Duke, now calmer, convinced Victoria that everything was fine and asked her not to worry about him. Victoria bowed and left, and Rosalie asked her husband not to be so harsh and for everyone to talk calmly. The woman sat Aiden next to her, and he with a serious face asked the Duke why he and Victoria had decided to marry. Chester understood that they were being given a chance, and that meant not everything was lost. Sitting up straight, he firmly told the girl's parents that he loved their daughter in this Recogió manhwa. The man wanted to know how long it had been since they confessed their feelings and when it all began. Thoughtfully, the Duke admitted that at first he didn't like Victoria, since unpleasant rumors were circulating about her. He believed them judged the girl, and really came to doubt her. However, the closer he got to her, the more he realized that the rumors were false. Victoria, since there were unpleasant rumors about her, he believed them judged the girl, and really began to doubt her. However, the closer he got to her, the more he realized that the rumors were false. Chester confirmed that she was a strong person, but sincere and loving. The Duke confessed that she was very different from him, someone strict with others, and true to his principles. He told Victoria's parents how something clicked inside him and he fell in love with the girl on Aiden and Rosalie's faces. It was evident that the Duke's story had moved them. However, the Baron still thought that getting married was a hasty and impulsive decision. Since they were both very young, Chester apologized for his selfishness, pointing out that Victoria was the only one who truly made him want to be her husband. Hearing this, Rosalie smiled, remembering how she and the Baron also got married just 2 months after meeting. She nostalgically recalled that back then, everyone was against, but she and Aiden didn't care. The woman expressed her hope that the Duke and Victoria felt the same. Meanwhile, the girl walked back and forth in the hallway in front of the door, thinking about what was happening in the room. Very worried when she saw the Duke leave the room, she ran toward him to find out what her parents had said. He leaned toward her to whisper the answer in her ear, and Victoria waited with her heart in her throat for what he was going to tell her. However, Chester only whispered that it was a secret and turned to go to the dining room, where they had agreed to meet again with the parents, distancing himself with a smile from the confused Victoria. She was turning the request of her parents to take care of their daughter over in her head. Hiding from Leon, who was looking for him everywhere, Jason thought about the problem he had ahead. He knew that if he couldn't contact his master, he could get very angry. If he hadn't felt compassion for the boy that night, none of this would have happened. Jason had to get rid of the magic blocker as soon as possible, whatever it took. Something had to happen. Jason had to get rid of the magic blocker as soon as possible, no matter what. While looking for a place to hide from Leon, the cat climbed onto one of the castle balconies upon seeing the Duke's office door. Hyzen started scratching it, hoping that Chester would be there. Leon approached from behind and happily caught the cat, who had been found. The cat tried unsuccessfully to escape from his arms. Holding the cat tightly, the boy shared his worries about the departure of Victoria. Victoria found the Duke and her father in the cellar, choosing wine for the dinner with a smile. The girl reminded Chester how he had told her he didn't drink. The Duke jumped at hearing that the Baron wanted to have a drink with his future son-in-law. Victoria was about to tell Chester that it was time to go back, but Rosalie asked her not to worry and to let them spend time together. The woman took her daughter away and wished the men to have fun. Victoria feared that her father would make the Duke uncomfortable with strange questions, but the Baroness calmed her down because if Chester didn't like Aiden, he wouldn't have invited him to drink. After a while, the four sat down to dinner, and the girl noticed how well her parents got along with the Duke. Victoria was impressed by how well he presented himself, managing to convince the Baron and the Baroness. At the end of dinner, the Duke and Aiden were already visibly cheerful, and Rosalie apologized to her daughter for that. She suggested taking Chester to the guest room so he could rest and recover. With the help of the butler, Murphy Victoria took the Duke to the guest room and stood next to him. When she asked him how he felt, Chester murmured something unintelligible and looked at her in a way that made her heart race. To her horror, Victoria realized that the Duke's disheveled appearance was very attractive to her. Noticing that she couldn't look at him without those thoughts, the girl decided to leave the room as soon as possible, apologizing in advance for having to touch him. She helped him undress and laid him on the pillows. Victoria thought that the Duke and the Baron must have had a great chat since both ended up quite drunk. In reality, during this conversation, the girl's father was telling Chester about his childhood. Aiden commented that, despite the rumors, Victoria had a wonderful character, and the proof was how she cared for Leon. Despite the rumors, Victoria had a wonderful character, and the proof was how she took care of Leon. The Baron confessed that he was worried about what people thought of his wedding, because although his family was noble, not too much, the rumors about the girl were not very good. In response, Chester assured that the Baron shouldn't worry, because he would defend Victoria from anyone who dared to hurt her. Then the Duke was telling his future father-in-law with a smile how fascinated he was by the girl's beauty and singing, recalling that Chester couldn't stop smiling, even as he fell asleep, and Victoria thought it was because of the alcohol. Wishing him good night. The girl was about to leave, but the Duke murmured something to himself again. Chester spoke so unclearly that Victoria, without understanding what he was saying, leaned closer to him. Chester took her hands and asked her not to speak to him so formally. Victoria didn't understand what he meant, and the Duke, smiling, asked her to call him by his name. Meanwhile, Bill was putting on the mask again and smashing everything. Was furious because Jason was still not showing any signs of life. A little calmer, he waved his hand and ordered the servants to find him and find out what had happened. Chester approached the surprised Victoria and gently caressed her cheek with his hand, smiling. He said that from now on he also wanted to call her by her name, and Victoria felt her heart break, unable to bear the tension. She turned to run out of the room, supposedly to get honey water for the hangover, but before she could leave, Chester took her by the hand and got out of bed, asking her to stay. It turned out that he thought all of this was a dream, because otherwise Victoria wouldn't have accepted his caress. He thought that if it weren't a dream, she wouldn't look at him that way. Realizing it was a dream, the Duke decided not to fear the girl's reaction. He thought nothing would happen if he told her what troubled him inside, holding his head with his hands. Chester confessed that his whole life he believed he didn't need a family. To his bewilderment, he explained that he had always been used to loneliness. To him, family was nothing more than a prison under the control of his father, who beat and oppressed him precisely because of his father, who used force for any reason. Just for being a father, family was always hell for Chester. When he grew up, he left home and for a time wandered alone in the world. Then he thought that loneliness was the best option. But upon meeting Victoria, he changed his mind immediately. If it weren't for that obstacle, he would have expressed right away his desire and selfishness to be with her. Taking the girl's hand, Chester confessed that for the first time. He wanted to overcome that barrier of his vision of family. Suddenly, he fell silent, and the Duke wondered why, if it was just a dream, he still had so much desire to sleep, closing his eyes and tightly squeezing Victoria's hand. Chester let himself fall onto the bed and began to snore loudly. The Duke held her so tightly that she couldn't break free, so she ended up falling onto the bed next to him. No matter how much she tried to free her hand, she couldn't. Looking at the sleeping Duke, Victoria thought about how sincere he was when he was drunk in this Recogió manhwa. The girl went over Chester's monologue in her mind and tried to understand what he wanted to tell her, but he fell asleep without finishing. Upon waking, the Duke couldn't understand how he had gotten drunk and fallen asleep at the first meeting with Victoria's parents. Just when he was about to get up to leave, he jumped, startled, noticing that Victoria was also snoring beside him in bed. The Duke was so surprised he fell out of bed onto the floor and woke the girl. She explained to him that she couldn't leave because Chester was holding her hand tightly, so she fell asleep next to him. Victoria complained that her wrist hurt, and the Duke, misunderstanding, began to tremble in fear at what he had done, laughing that Chester didn't understand her well. The girl explained to him that her wrist hurt, smiling, offered her hand, and suggested taking a walk since the Duke felt a little better. During the walk, the girl noticed that Chester was serious and strict again, but in reality he was serious, because he was worried about how poorly he had probably behaved while drunk. Victoria asked him how he felt, and the Duke revealed that he was already completely sober. The girl cheerfully told him that Chester had done a great job and had presented himself very well to her parents. Turning around and continuing the path, she decided to talk about the next steps and asked if the wedding ceremony would be simple. Since the wedding was fake, Victoria didn't see the need for a big celebration, thinking that for her, all of this was just acting. Chester told her he would take her words into account. Suddenly turning to the girl, he asked if she could accompany him to the banquet next week. The banquet was planned to celebrate Count Humphrey's birthday. Mrs. Selina. Since many nobles were going to meet, the Duke had to present himself appropriately. In reality, he didn't want to go. But Ron tried to convince him not to decline the Count's invitation. It was the butler who advised the Duke to go with Victoria since the wedding was near and it needed to be announced. Looking at the thoughtful girl, Chester thought that she surely didn't want to draw too much attention, however. Before he could suggest that she think about it, she immediately responded with a firm yes. The girl understood that the Duke cared, because it would be difficult for him to deal with so much attention when the contract ended. Because if he announced it, people would start talking and Victoria's parents wouldn't be happy with the rumors. However, for no one to find out that their wedding was a farce, she and the Duke would have to act like a couple in love. Victoria asked the Duke not to worry because even when they divorced, she didn't plan to marry again. Chester couldn't hide his joy knowing he would be the only one in her life. The girl noticed the change in his face. The Duke got up from the bench to say goodbye to Victoria's parents and returned to the castle. The girl asked how Leon was, whom she already missed so much. Chester told her about Leon's fight with Iris, which greatly amused Victoria. Noticing that his story had made her happy, the Duke became nervous as he expected a completely different reaction. But Victoria couldn't explain to him that the reason for her joy was that the main character of the novel had finally appeared. The girl only regretted not having seen the encounter between Leon and Iris with her own eyes, leaving the Duke utterly confused. Chester, who had stayed to talk about the boy, told Victoria that Marcus Hennerin wanted to leave Iris with the Duke for a while. The Marquis planned to move to the province so his wife could recover, but he didn't want to leave his daughter alone. The Duke wanted to know Victoria's opinion about his decision to take the girl away for a while. To the girl's surprise, by the question, the Duke responded that she was now part of the family. Victoria blushed, noticing at the same time a strange sparkling shine in her eyes. The girl realized that every time she saw Chester, her heart was about to burst from her chest and her hand trembled as she accidentally brushed against his fingers. Noticing that the atmosphere between them was becoming a bit strange, she quickly decided to accept and send the Duke home. Chester happily thanked her and decided to take Iris with him right after the wedding. The Duke's smile was so dazzling that the girl was left speechless for a moment, not knowing how to justify the way she was looking at him. Victoria said she had seen her favorite flowers in the distance. However, when she turned around, Chester was very surprised, because in the middle of the clearing, a huge Venus flytrap was growing. The sun was setting, and it was time for the Duke to say goodbye to Rosalie and the Baron, who was still staggering. Apparently, the alcohol had not completely worn off for the man, so he hugged the Duke tightly and began begging him to stay. Victoria pulled Chester away from her father and asked her mother to take him inside. The girl suggested to the Duke to wait for the carriage together and take a walk. When they reached the door, both stood silently for a moment, thinking about what to say to break the awkward moment. Remembering all of Ron's advice, Chester gathered his courage and asked Victoria what her plans were for tomorrow. She replied that she planned to go to the commercial street where they sold magical items. Quickly, the girl assured the Duke that she was just going to look, although in reality, she needed a poison revealer. In the original novel, since Leon returned to the Halo family, her life was always in danger. As he was the protagonist, he managed to survive, but Victoria had gotten too close to him, to just be watching. But as she had changed the order of the original story, something irreversible could happen. Finally, the carriage arrived, and the girl asked the Duke to be careful on the way. Before leaving, Chester asked Victoria if they could go to the commercial street together. He started to babble something senseless, but then he controlled himself and politely asked the girl to allow him to accompany her. Victoria didn't understand why he was acting so weird, as his invitation seemed like a date. She didn't understand why he just kept staring at her. While he was thinking if she didn't want to spend time with him, the girl accepted and asked if Leon would go with them, because she missed him. Thoughtful and sad because he couldn't invite Victoria on a date alone, Chester went home. When Leon finally fell asleep, Hayden noticed that the maid hadn't closed the window properly. Climbing onto the balcony and pushing the window, the cat jumped outside to go with his owner, happy that no one had seen him. He ran quickly to the door and jumped, but suddenly something blocked his way. Falling to the ground, Hayden realized there was an invisible barrier around the castle. Not far away in some bushes, Bill's servants were hiding, discussing a plan to find Hayden. One of them insisted that the castle was too well guarded to sneak in without being seen. The other said they couldn't return empty-handed because their master might cut their necks. That's why they suddenly heard the castle knights talking about burying a dead cat that they had found near the door. One of them recognized the animal as that strange cat that had been hanging around the property for several days. Realizing that the knights were talking about Heisenbill's servants, were horrified at the thought that they would have to tell their master what they saw. When Bill found out that Heisen was dead without removing his mask, he angrily grabbed a servant by the neck out of control, smashing everything in his path. He ordered them to bring him the heads of the entire Halo family. When the servants ran out to fulfill the order, Bill took off his mask, thinking with hatred that the Halo family had killed his mother first and now Hayden. Regaining consciousness, the cat emerged from the ground, not understanding why they had buried him. Anyway, he now knew that the barrier covered the entire territory of the castle, and there wasn't a single crack to pass through. Since he couldn't do anything in a cat's body, Hayden had to come up with something to remove the magic blocker as soon as possible. The cat returned to Leon, and the boy brought the dirty animal to the maid. The child asked T to check if the cat was injured, as it was clear he had gone outside. After checking the cat all over, the maid found no injuries, but said that she and the boy were going to bathe. Both the boy and the cat tried to escape from T's hands, who was determined to take them to the bath. The butler received Chester when he returned and asked him how the presentation had gone. Hearing noise in Leon's room, the Duke went to see what was happening. However, Ron was still trying to pry from Chester how the day had been. Remembering the day's moments, the Duke smiled unintentionally. Noticing this, the butler assumed that everything had gone wonderfully. But suddenly Chester pounced on him angrily, saying it was Ron's fault that they hadn't liked his gift, even though he didn't understand what he had done wrong since the Duke had personally bought it. Chester couldn't stop anymore, and gave Ron the chance to fix it by ordering him to reserve a table at a nice restaurant on the commercial street. The Duke wanted the butler to reserve the table for tomorrow and also find out what Victoria's favorite food was. Additionally, remembering that Leon would go with them, Chester requested to find a place with a play area. Upon learning that the restaurants Ron proposed didn't have a play area, the Duke ordered him to install one before tomorrow. Besides that, instead of reserving only 3 spots, Chester ordered to reserve the whole street for them in this recap manhwa. Ron went to fulfill the orders, thinking that this peculiar first love of the Duke would one day end up with him. Seeing his uncle at the door, Leon ran happily toward him, explaining that he had bathed at that hour because the cat had gotten him dirty. Chester told the boy that tomorrow they would go see Victoria. The excited boy jumped into the Duke's neck and hugged him tightly, burying his nose in his nephew's hair. Chester thought that he was also looking forward to the encounter with the girl.